Hello, I'm Russell Smith and welcome to Petri's Get It one-day virtual conference on endpoint management. Today's sessions are designed to help you better understand how to manage your endpoints using on-premises, cloud and hybrid cloud solutions. They're going to be delivered by a range of industry experts and Microsoft valuable professionals. Endpoint management is now a hot topic since the global health pandemic started, because not only are organizations rushing to extend their remote access solutions, but they also now have to support a much larger number of remote devices. And many organizations are now looking to adopt a hybrid work approach where some workers are in the office, others are at home, and that's bringing much greater challenges for IT departments as they need to make sure that all devices are secure, that data is secured, those devices are patched and securely configured regardless of their location. So these sessions are going to bring a wealth of knowledge and skills that you can apply in your own environment. And we're going to cover technologies like Intune, Autopilot, Windows Update for Business, and Configuration Manager. I'd like to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Devolutions, because without them, we couldn't offer free sessions like today's conference. You can also get the handouts even before any of the sessions have started, which include the slides for each session, and you can get them in the link in the description for this live stream, or on the page for each of the sessions, or by going to the conference landing page at petri.com/conferences. The first session is going to start in a few minutes. That's going to be delivered by Dean Ellaby, and it's on managing hybrid Windows 10 devices on the internet using Intune and Configuration Manager. And at 10:15 Eastern Time, we have a session on how to achieve better endpoint management with a remote connection tool, and that's delivered by Devolutions. At 11, Rue Campbell is going to deliver a session on Windows Autopilot, and then at 12 o'clock, Michael Reinders is going to be talking about best practices for managing Windows updates. And last but not least, at 1 p.m, we have Todd Clint, who's going to be talking about managing Microsoft 365 users with PowerShell. Now, don't forget that if you're not able to attend the whole of today's sessions, or maybe you want to rewatch a session, the entire conference will be available on demand after the stream has finished today. And there's also a live chat happening on the YouTube channels, so please do feel free to take part in that. So without further ado, let's get started and enjoy the conference.
Hi everyone, my name is Dean Ellaby, and this session is going to be about managing hybrid Windows 10 devices on the internet with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and organizer at the cloud management community. I'm also a contributor at Petri.com, and I make videos at the cloud management community YouTube channel. Just to set expectations, there won't be a ton of slides in this deck, but I will make sure that I put all the links and information on the code that you might need to get started in that deck, so do make sure you download it at the end. My preferred method of doing these videos and these talks is it is demo heavy, so that's pretty much what you're going to get. So what is Endpoint Manager? Well, I'm going to cover this quickly because most of you probably already know this, given that you're more than halfway through the Endpoint Management one-day virtual conference. But Endpoint Manager is Microsoft's endpoint management solution, which includes Config Manager and Intune, as well as a bunch of other additional capabilities that enhance the solution. So I'm not going to delve too deep into the content of this slide, but the point I want to make is that both of these solutions are very much current. So they're both part of the same story, and you can consider them part of the same solution. I would often get questions from customers asking, can Intune do this? Or does Intune have this feature that AirWatch or Workspace ONE has? Obviously, my answer would be different depending on the question, but sometimes the answer was simply, no, Intune can't do that, because Intune is only one of the tiny parts of the tools that and capabilities that are available in Microsoft Endpoint Manager. To manage today's endpoints, we can leverage both Intune and Config Manager in unison. So for traditional domain joined devices, you might want to use Config Manager, and for cloud-only devices, such as mobiles, you might want to use Intune. There are some things where Intune is better than Config Manager. So, and there are some things where Config Manager is better than Intune. So for example, managing updates. It's a load easier to manage updates in Intune for Windows updates and Microsoft updates via Windows Update for Business than it is in Config Manager, for example. But Config Manager is able to deploy bare metal devices, those that don't have an operating system on them already, and is significantly better at things like software inventory. In situations where you don't want to choose one or the other, you can use both, and that is through a concept called co-management. So let's take a look at what that looks on the slide. So if we bring this all to a point, then really we're talking about hybrid Windows 10 devices on the internet. So the stuff on the far left of this diagram is not really relevant because that's on-premise devices only, domain joined computers. And the stuff on the right-hand side is cloud only. And we will talk about cloud only a little bit later. But for now, with regards to managing just hybrid devices, we'll just remove those from the slide. So here we go. And what we're left with is hybrid Windows 10 devices. Now, I will say the word hybrid has too many meanings in the world and also in technology today. So in this context, when I say hybrid, I mean domain joined and synchronized to Azure via Azure AD Connect. Out of the box, Config Manager requires devices to have an internal network connectivity of some sort, either by being in the office or on a corporate WAN or LAN, or often just via a VPN. In most organizations today, there is a shift to remote work and working from home. Most users will have a VPN that they'll access corporate resources with, and the thing is that sometimes these VPNs are user triggered or just not working, and generally we aren't always able to guarantee that we're able to connect to these devices when they're on the VPN or when they're outside the office. So to ensure that we can manage devices regardless of the user state, regardless of anything that the user might be able to have an impact on, we can leverage something called the Cloud Management Gateway. So the Cloud Management Gateway requires at least one HTTPS or enhanced HTTP management point. It allows devices to be fully managed via Config Manager whilst on the internet without a VPN, and it's hosted on Azure. Now, with Config Manager 2107 and above, it can be deployed as a VM scale set rather than the classic solution. The Cloud Management Gateway is essentially a cloud-hosted management point for Config Manager. It allows us to connect to devices when they're on the internet, without needing any of your internal corporate resources. It uses a proxy to connect to your on-premise management point, and that proxy could be your on-premise management point. From a licensing perspective, all the techniques and capabilities that we'll describe in this session are available in the core Microsoft 365 E3 or A3 or equivalent SKU. More specifically, Intune per user or per device licenses are probably going to be needed, along with the use rights for Config Manager. Now, I do love a good demo, so in a minute we're going to jump over to my Config Manager lab and take a look at some of this in use. First, though, I want to explain the setup. We have 4 machines that you need to care about. We've got a domain controller called DC1. We have a Config Manager 2107 primary site called CM1, a cloud management gateway hosted in Azure, a gateway server called GW1. Now, this GW1 is not the CMG, it's just a server that allows me to proxy internet out of my on-premise resources via RAS. And we've got a Windows 10 computer called CMC DJ01, I think. And this is connected to the internet only. So this is not at all a complicated setup, but its functionality is similar to many organizations using Config Manager. Let's jump over to my demo and I'll show you what we're doing. So there's a few things you need to know about my example client, this DJ01 computer. Firstly, it's hybrid domain joined, it's not co-managed, and it's not Intune enrolled. So let's take a look at how we know that. If we open up PowerShell and then type dsreg cmd status, we get a few nuggets of information that allow us to determine the type of join this device has. So it's got Azure AD join and it's got domain join. So this is referred to as a hybrid join device. And so before we move off that point, what is a hybrid Azure AD device? Well, as I said before, it's created on-premise, so it's AD joined, but it's synchronized to Azure via Azure AD Connect. So there are loads of problems that are created when you have your devices configured in this way. For one, deployments take a lot longer and they're a lot more difficult. Sure, so hybrid AD Autopilot can work fine, but it's hard and it's full of stuff that can go wrong. And it's not as good as cloud only from a user experience perspective. Secondly, you're not really getting the best out of the cloud connected device when you go hybrid. There's a massive reliance on the domain controller and line of sight to that domain controller. So even simple things like a password reset suddenly become more difficult. Even if you have self-service password reset set up, that means a user can reset their password from the cloud without having any, need to come into the office. That suddenly goes out the window when you have them not being able to log into their laptop because the password hasn't caught up. The laptop itself needs to connect to the on-premise domain controller in order to pick up that change, and that absolutely ruins the user experience when you have this always online, always connected user. There are more reasons, but this talk is meant to be about how to manage these devices that are in this state, so let's get back to that. Now I said it wasn't co-managed, so let's check that out. We'll go into Control Panel and take a look at the Config Manager applet to see what it says about the co-management state of this device. And if we look here, you can see the co-management capabilities is 1, but the co-management state is disabled, so it's not co-managed. I also said it wasn't in tune enrolled, so let's take a look at how we can find that information out. We'll just go into Settings and Accounts, and then over to Access Work or School. And if this was in tune enrolled, you would see that there was a little info button here where we could have a look at the MDM policies that were being applied. It isn't in tune enrolled, so that's good. So the other thing to know about this computer is that it's not connected to the corporate LAN right now. It's using cached credentials for Lucy Tester to log in, but otherwise there's no connectivity. I'll show you what I mean. So if we look at the ability for this computer to ping DC1, for example, it can't do it. So it can maybe look it up from the cached DNS, but it can't actually connect to it. So this has no internal connectivity at all. So how is this computer going to be able to access the content that we deploy to it for maybe an application that I want to deploy in a few moments? Well, if we go back to the control panel and take a look at the Config Manager applet, we should be able to see that we've got connectivity via the Cloud Management Gateway. So in network, you can see that we've got an internet-based management point, which is this location here. Okay, so we want to deploy an example application. Perhaps VLC Media Player will be ideal because I've already got it packaged up in Config Manager ready to go. So let's take a look at Config Manager and see how we do this. So in the applications node, we've got VLC Media Player, and we've got a deployment type here, and I'll create another deployment shortly. If we go to properties, we can take a look at where the content is for this application. If we go to content locations, you can see I've already distributed it to the GMCMG VMSS2 Cloud App Azure management distribution point, and that is the Cloud Management Gateway. So very simple, it just acts as a normal distribution point from a config manager perspective, and it's got the content. So it's just a case of deploying this application to my computer. So we'll take a look at the deployment we've already got, which is app-install VLC Media Player. Okay, great. So I'm just going to add my example computer, which is DJ01, into this collection here, and then we'll see how we go. Take a look at the computers that are currently in it. Okay, so we've got DJ02 in there at the moment, but I'm just going to add my DJ01 computer in there so that we can do this demonstration. Okay, so we'll give that a few moments to process, but in the meantime, let's take a look at this screen here. So this is the standard devices screen that you get in Config Manager, and you can see a bit of information about DJ01. So as you can see, we have a logged in user called lucy.tester, the site code, the activity, and then we've got these two new items specific to the Cloud Management Gateway. So we've got device online from internet, yes, and that essentially tells us that it's not connected via the internal management point directly. And then the device online management point. Now, if you've only got one management point in the cloud, one cloud management gateway, this obviously always will say the same one, but this is allowing you to identify which cloud management gateway it's accessing. As you can see here, this computer is accessing GMCMG VMSS2 in the UK South region. We'll head over to my collection again just to take a look at what's going on there and check if CMC DJ1 is there, which it is. So that's all good. Now remember, this computer is connected via the CMG. It's technically online. There's nothing remote about it apart from it being connected via the internet. So we can still use device commands to run, you know, a computer policy retriever and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to just do the client notification, download computer policy, and get that to pull the latest policy down as soon as it can. In the client computer itself, if we go to Software Center and take a look to see if the application has become available yet, because remember, when I created this application, I set it to be available rather than required, just so we can actually see how this works. So as you can see, there are no applications just yet, but we've kicked off that machine policy retrieval, so it shouldn't be too long before it applies. As you can see, it's just popped up just there. So we've got the VLC media player by Videolan. We just click it and we choose install. Now, this content will come directly from the Cloud Management Gateway, and I can show you that again. Just if we head back to the application itself in Config Manager, and just remind you, we only saw it a few moments ago, but I want to just point out the fact that the content is not on my local management point, on my local distribution point. I've got a distribution point here, local to the network, local to my lab, but I haven't put the content there. So if this content is going to come from anywhere, it's going to be coming from the internet. So it's just a case of choosing install here, and this content will come directly over the internet to our computer. As you can see, it says uninstall and the status is installed. Well, that's a good sign. If we have a look here, you can see we've got VLC installed, all good. So with the CMG being located on the internet and accessible via the internet, it's ideal for those computers that are outside the corporate network, computers that aren't going to be regularly coming into the office, or maybe offices that are remote. If we take a look at the slides, we've got these devices, this one on the right hand side connected to the cloud there, might be using a VPN, or it might not. So we need to be able to get the optimal experience for the end user and for traffic. We usually want to ensure that traffic and data and that kind of thing will come to and from our CMG without going through the corporate network. So you might think that's just a case of whitelisting this IP on your firewall, or allowing computers that use a VPN to bypass the proxy when connecting to this specific IP. But that's not the case. The CMG doesn't host the content that's being referenced by the applications that you're deploying via the CMG. The content is hosted elsewhere. It's hosted in a lot of places. So when a computer connects to the internet to access the CMG, it discovers the location of the CMG and it can connect to that. But when it wants to access the content and stuff that's being distributed to the CMG, it needs to figure out where that content is, because it's not hosted on the CMG, it's hosted in Azure storage. So for this reason, it's almost impossible to use IP-based allow listing to make this work. Azure has hundreds of IP addresses that can be used by the storage that you need access to. So ideally, you'll need to reference this CMG by the host name. So the next step on getting the best experience for your end users is to not just rely on the CMG when they're on the internet. As I said earlier on, Intune can do some things much better than Config Manager can, and it's much easier to configure in some ways as well. So what if you don't want to use the CMG, or you don't want to use it specifically for this type of workload? Well, that's where co-management comes in. So as you can see, co-management requires Intune, and it allows different workloads to be shifted to the cloud. On the diagram on the right hand side, you can see we've got the CMG still connecting to these computers and doing its config manager related stuff, but you also have Intune doing some cloud management stuff. So with co-management, for example, we can shift Windows updates to the cloud, meaning we don't need to mess around with automatic deployment rules, software update points, WSUS, all that kind of stuff. Let's take a look at how co-management helps. So I've switched to a different computer for this part of the demonstration, and this computer is called DJ02. And the reason I've switched to a different computer is because this one is co-managed, and it's not simply just managed by Config Manager. So if we go into the Configuration Manager applet, you can see that its co-management capabilities are significantly higher than 1, and its co-management state is enabled. It's also hybrid joined. Show that for this device. Azure AD joined and domain joined, so that's hybrid. Okay, so that's the device itself. Let's take a look at what Config Manager thinks about this device before we move into Intune and see what it sees. So DJ02 is the device that we're talking about here, and jump into the devices node directly so we can see this. So device online management point is the internal management point, and it's not online from the internet. But if we open up another column here, we go to co-managed, and you can see that co-managed is yes. So what can we do? Well, we can do all the normal actions that you can do with Config Manager. These ones here, that's all good. And obviously we could deploy applications via Config Manager to this device. It's just a normal Config Manager client. So what does Intune think? So here is the Intune portal for this. It's the Microsoft Endpoint Manager portal. And as you can see, it says it's managed by co-managed. It's compliant and all that kind of stuff. So that's really good. And if we click on the device itself, if you've ever used Intune, you can see that we've got a few extra features on the left-hand side here that are specific to co-managed devices. So we've got Resource Explorer, client details, timelines, collections, applications, all these things that are specific Config Manager concepts. We also have some additional capabilities under the More menu here. So these are all the standard ones that you get with Intune, and then additional sync machine policy, sync user policy, and app evaluation cycle. These are Config Manager related things. So we can suddenly use the Intune portal to do some Config Manager related things. And that's a fantastic concept where you consider that you might have to have some of your Intune trained support staff manage devices that are on premise. This is a fantastic way to do that. Now this specifically, that bit I've just talked about, doesn't require co-management. It requires something called Cloud Attach, and that is something that you enable when you configure co-management, but it can be enabled on its own. So I said that Intune can do some things relatively better than Config Manager. So let's take a look at one of those things that I personally think Intune can do better than Config Manager, and that's update management for Microsoft updates. So if we just head back to the home and choose devices, and then go into update rings for Windows 10. You can see I've got an update ring here called current Windows 10 called current update ring 1 first look testers. And there's a few settings on this that I want to just quickly show you. So it's the semi-annual channel, and it's managing Microsoft product update Windows drivers with 0 deferral. So this is a kind of a policy we'll put in place for the testers that really want the update immediately to see if there's anything wrong, and just do that quick test to make sure everything's going to work when it rolls out to the rest of the fleet. So the uninstall period is set to 10 days by default, so we'll leave it at that. And then it's going to install and reboot without the end user control, and it's going to do restart checks to make sure that they're not in a presentation, for example, and something that would really annoy them or ruin their day. And then it's got a deadline for feature updates of 30 days and a deadline for quality updates of 2 days. So there's a 0-day grace period. So this is a really harsh policy for those users. And you can see I've got a group here, update ring 1 first look testers. And so if you grab that group name and take a look at that group, just in groups, you can see I've got one member in that group, and that's DJ02. But that's not necessarily all we need to do. So we need to get the computer to understand which authority it should be respecting when it comes to Windows updates or application deployment and all that kind of stuff. We need to tell it which it's using. Is it going to be Config Manager or is it going to be Intune? So we do that in the Config Manager portal. It's not a portal, it's the console. And so in the console, we need to configure co-management. We do that over in administration and cloud attach, properties. And this is where we get to set which workloads are going to be managed by Config Manager and which workloads are going to be managed by Intune. So I mentioned this cloud attach thing earlier on. This is where you, with co-management, you do need to enable cloud attach. And you can upload devices here. For me, I've uploaded all my devices. I didn't want to upload a specific collection. This is where we enable co-management, and you can see I've enabled it on a pilot basis for devices within co-managed devices. And then from a workloads perspective, these are the workloads that we are piloting in Azure. You can see on the right hand side there, we've got Windows updates policies are managed by Config Manager. In order to get that fully managed by Intune, we will go to the right hand side, and that will enable it for all devices that are co-managed. But I want to just test that out, so we'll go slide that across to the middle there to Pilot Intune. And the only difference between Pilot Intune and one of the other ones is that the computer needs to be in a collection in order for it to be able to be piloted. So we get that collection in staging, and you can see now I've got this little red exclamation mark here or red symbol here, and this is where I need to choose the collection that I'm going to be doing pilot testing in with Windows Update policies. So if we choose browse and then go to, for me, I'm just doing a pilot of all the stuff at the same time, so I'll just go to co-managed devices, and that will add this computer to be managed by Intune rather than Config Manager. So that is all we need to do in order to get that device managed by Intune rather than Config Manager. So we'll head over to the device itself in Intune and see what we get. So as you can see, CMC DJ02 has a deployment status of pending. And if we go with the device itself and type Windows Updates, now this was specified to deploy without user interaction, so I'm hoping, yeah, okay, so it started to download that update for me, and no doubt in a few moments, once it's finished downloading, installing actually, it will reboot without my interaction. But what if we don't want to use Config Manager at all? What if we're looking to remove all of our on-premise servers completely and move everything to the cloud? Well, that's where Intune Cloud-Only Management comes in. So whether devices are hybrid or not, we can still manage them via Intune. See, because when we talk about device management for domain joined devices, it's not Config Manager or co-management. It's config manager, co-management, or Intune. And the latter of those two can actually manage domain joined devices on the internet. So let's take a look at cloud-only management via Intune. As you can see, it requires Intune, obviously, and it can manage both hybrid and Azure AD devices. So this is now looking just at the right-hand side of that diagram that I showed at the start. And if we take a look at our config manager console, you can see CMC DJ03 doesn't have the config manager client installed. So it's not managed by config manager or co-managed. If we take a look at the Intune console, into devices, you can see it is managed by Intune and it's a corporate device. It's compliant, which is great. So I mentioned that some of the items that we saw in the menus on the previous computer, the ones below manage apps, were specific to co-managed devices. You can see they're not there right now, and then in the more menu we're missing those few at the bottom there as well. But this is an Intune managed device, so we can deploy applications to it, for example. Let's take a look at an application I deployed earlier on, which is 7-zip. Here he is. And if I choose device install status, you should see that CMC DJ3 is installed. So this computer has been deployed, has had an application deployed to it. If we take a look at the computer itself, you should see it has 7-zip installed. There it is. And it's also got the Intune management extension, because 7-zip requires 7-zip is an executable installer. It's a Win32 app, so it requires this additional Intune management extension in order to be able to do that installation for us. So one of the things it hasn't got on this computer is Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Office, that kind of thing. So let's just deploy that. In my applications, over here, apps, we've got M365 apps for enterprise. And I'm just going to very quickly deploy this to this computer. And it's already required to this group here. So let's put that computer into this group. So remember, this computer is not co-managed or managed by config manager, so we're limited in the way we can interact with it. But if we go to the device management portal here, we can synchronize this device, which means it will check in, get its latest policy, and hopefully start downloading that application shortly. What I've tried to demo in this talk is that there isn't one right answer for managing hybrid devices on the internet. You've got co-management, you've got config manager, you've got Intune, and if you stick Cloud Management Gateway into the mix, you can manage your devices on the internet without needing to be on your office or on the VPN. Hopefully you found this useful. Thank you to Petri for allowing me to do this, and to all the other amazing speakers that have come before me and will come afterwards, and also thank you to you for watching. For now, see you next time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this very special session here brought to you by Devolutions. My name is Jan, I'm here with Maurice. And I don't know if you know about Devolutions, but we're here to help really bring productivity and security solutions to IT professionals. So today we're here to discuss, and mainly Maurice is going to be discussing this, how to achieve better endpoint management with the proper remote connection tool. But before we get started with that, I want to introduce Maurice a little bit first. So Maurice here is our VP of Business Solutions here at Devolutions. And my name is Yann Lamasson, and here I'm in charge of all the audio and video productions here for Devolutions. But enough about us. Today we wanted to really talk about remote connections, as well as endpoint management. And if you have any questions during our session, either before, during, or after, right?
I should be there already.
And you can he'll be able to answer any of your questions whatsoever about anything we talk about today. First of all, what are connection managers? You want to tell us about that a little bit?
Well, it's a tool to manage remote connections, but to connect remotely to an endpoint, you need a protocol. So we see on there, our bread and butter is surely RDP and SSH, but more mature connection managers, they will support a bunch of protocols. We support more than 150 technologies in Remote Desktop Manager. So I'm trying to walk the thin line between talking about connection managers,
Sure.
but I'll mention Remote Desktop Manager a lot.
Okay.
Because we can showcase a lot of these possibilities with our tool. But there are, from RDCman, which Microsoft created, mRemote, which was open source, which is open source, but then mRemote NG. A bunch of our customers are talking about RoyalTS, Manage Engine, and Dameware, and stuff like that. So this is all good, really, products and services. But we'll see where you fit on that spectrum.
Yeah.
And if you're at the start of your career or in a smaller organization, up to a multinational that will interact with a privileged access management system.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Yeah. So there are basic features of a connection manager. Obviously, at RDCman supports RDP only.
Yep.
But still, advanced connection managers are multi-platform. So Linux, iOS, Android, Mac. So that's quite a lot of value-added capabilities when you can
especially
use your phone to do an RDP session and control servers remotely. That's not nice for your day-to-day job, but if you're on the road at night, it's quite nice to be able to diagnose an issue. Sometimes you're on the road, you're helping another customer, so it's quite important to have a really flexible tool.
Sure.
Again, as well as launching, like I like to call them prerequisites. So a VPN is a given, SSH tunneling, and so on and so on. And so that's quite nice when your connection manager can take care of that for you.
Yeah.
You don't need to handle, okay, is my tunnel open? Do I have the credentials for that? So a good tool should hide all of these concerns.
Yeah.
As well as credential management. You need to connect somewhere. You need credentials. So ideally, you have credentials either built in or you interact with, it can be the Windows Credential Manager, it can be KeePass, 1Password. A flexible tool will allow you to use your credentials wherever they may be.
Sure, absolutely.
So that's what we consider advanced. So that's where you need to go on outside of RDCman and remote, the basic one. So you need to add on some beef, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, the next evolution, let's say, is time-saving features. Because if you manage, let's say, switches, and you connect every week or month to perform your updates, so we can automate a lot of that, and we can allow you to broadcast. mRemote was, I think, the first that created that feature, to have multiple tabs and type commands, and they're broadcasted to all of your windows. So you can do really updates in a short duration. We also see features like remote software inventory, so to detect what is present. There are a bunch of technologies to do that. Our free product uses WMI, but some products have extension points where you could use PowerShell, let's say, to do that, perform that remote inventory. Remote shutdown restarts, and that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but running scripts remotely but locally. So that that means that script will be sent to the remote endpoint, and it will be run from there. So you don't need to worry about remote management capabilities, because there are some concerns. There are a lot of hoops to jump through to get at remote management. So by doing this, it can be really nice for your day-to-day.
Absolutely.
And then the next, we move on to enterprise features.
Okay.
So rather than playing in your own sandbox, you want to share all of that information. So your endpoints, your credentials, and so on and so on. So they can be, rather than on your single computer, they can be shared across a whole organization.
Sure.
So we see their role-based access control, fully mature product will most likely integrate with AD, Azure AD, some type of identity providers.
Yeah.
So you don't need to worry about managing yet another identity for your users.
Sure.
We see about account and user discovery, machine discovery, so as well as login reporting. So that's where you're getting really. That's why I say enterprise. You can manage a whole lot of devices, endpoints, and users if you have these capabilities.
It's also important to know that these are the features that kind of are, expected in a mature product.
Yes.
So that as you work your way up, you can always expand to that level. And so it'd be helpful to have a tool that kind of can handle both, right?
But there's a twist.
Yes.
Because you can be a small business, a small mom and pop shop.
Yeah.
And you can be a managed service provider where you manage a whole organization's infrastructure.
Sure.
So you're handling, I don't know, most likely it's going to be a small to medium business as well. So maybe 100 computers, a large network. So small businesses can manage medium businesses' infrastructures.
Sometimes in the industry, it's hard because small does not mean not important. Because you can have small, but you still need security, you still need to manage roles and permissions and access, and you still need access to do everything from the highest standards. Just because you're small doesn't mean, oh, well, we don't need these features, you know?
2021 is quite different than 2016, you know, cybersecurity-wise. We saw, in fact, organizations jump 1 or 2 levels in their security posture and their concerns as well. We will see privileged access management really quickly, but these guys, they're focusing so much on security and auditability that they have a huge hit on productivity.
Sure.
So we pretend that our tool gives you back almost all of that lost productivity.
Yeah.
Because we'll take care of a bunch of concerns when you pair your connection manager with a PAM.
Absolutely.
We believe in dog fooding. We use it ourselves in all layers of our business, and it's extremely useful. For sure.
Absolutely.
We have 400,000 users of our paid edition and more users of the free edition.
Sure.
So we have a lot of feature requests and user input, definitely.
Absolutely. Great.
Okay, so on to security features. Obviously, if you're holding the keys to the kingdom, so you don't want your database to be stolen or data just to be available for a bad guy. So encryption at rest is key, and as well as another feature that is a bit more subtle, and we're extremely good at that, is to inject credentials. So we call that account brokering. It's not a widely used term because not a lot of guys out there are strong in that area. So we inject credentials without revealing the password to the end user. So for if you're using our free product, it's not really one of its strengths because you're alone. So obviously you're going to be available to see all of the credentials that you use.
Sure.
But if you pair us with a PAM solution, you can rest assured that the contractor that you will give access to a set of credentials will be able to use them without ever being able to see them.
That's really cool.
So that's really our strength. It's quite useful if you have, let's say, help desk, service desk, and you don't want to divulge the passwords to the help desk. Well, they can definitely log on to endpoints and websites without ever knowing the credentials. So that is key, a key security feature in our mind.
Cool.
And then we jump to the ultimate protection level.
Yep.
When you store your privileged accounts in a PAM solution. So it allows for safekeeping. There's a vault. Password vaulting is one of the essential features of a PAM.
Yes.
So it stores, it shares securely, it controls. There are approval workflows to get at a set of credentials. When you're done, you can check in the credential back into the vault, which most likely will trigger a password rotation.
Yeah.
So even if you needed to see the password for some workflows,
Sure.
As soon as you're done, it is changed.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's the ultimate, and that's where in the past we'd see larger enterprises doing that, but nowadays medium businesses have a PAM solution.
So this is where I think we can offer something that is maybe unique because we can integrate all these aspects or just the aspects you need, right?
Right. We like to say a single pane of glass into your infrastructure. So we provide that visibility into your PAM, into your infrastructure, into your tools, into everywhere.
Yeah.
So our tool runs the whole day that you're online,
Absolutely.
It's always there. You can open a website, you can connect to endpoints, you can consult documentation, you can store documents in there. So it's really a tool that is created for being accessible at your fingertips and have everything in there. Okay, so we saw the PAM, and now you can be really at the start of that spectrum or at the end. You can choose, you can live with RDC man for the longest time. And then when you start to collaborate, I need for something better. So you just need to look at where you are, where you need to be, and how much time you want to save.
Yeah. No, it's so true. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think now we're moving on to a quick demo. There it is in all its glory.
Fantastic.
And obviously I won't type in stuff, so I'll import prepared entries.
Okay, good.
So entries, what are entries? This is an Active Directory dashboard entry.
Okay.
I've specified information to bind with the domain controller.
Great.
with an account that has read permissions. And if I launch it, you will see that it has detected a bunch of computers.
Oh, wow.
By the way, I started you can specify which OU to start under.
Yeah, organizational unit, yeah.
I'm going quickly for there. For the demo, I can use a bunch of settings. Let's say I want to create folders, and it's doing its job. And now I have a few hundred computers that are coming from my AD.
Wow, that's really cool.
Okay. I could have selected other templates, customize everything, choose another connection type. You can see maybe that it's an RDP icon that you're seeing.
Yeah, I see that.
So you see the richness of our settings available for RDP.
Sure.
We do have full control. You probably recognize the layout, and that's on purpose. We want to replicate what you're used to.
Yeah.
And connection and so on and so on. So that's done. So in a few seconds, I have all of my computers coming from my AD.
Nice.
And by the way, if you add other computers, we do have capabilities to connect with vSphere, with Azure, with Amazon Web EC2.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. So depending on the edition you're using, we have varying capabilities.
Okay.
But ultimately, if all you have is a CSV, we'll work with that as well.
Cool.
It works perfectly fine.
Very nice. Absolutely.
Okay. So that's that was my AD console. I can, if I show you the import screen, I can import not only sessions, so connections to endpoints,
Okay.
or I can import logins. Okay, so you see importing from KeyPass, from Dashlane, from Passportal, various formats in here. And again, if all else fails, you use CSV.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are connections, but I don't have credentials yet.
Okay.
So let's say, again, I could have imported, I could have bound myself to other password managers, but I'll create a username password entry. Easy it is. So B. Anderson. You can use the UPN syntax.
Okay.
You can use. I'm performed from my microphone. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah. You're good.
Okay. Okay. So now I have credentials that I can use in many ways.
Okay.
But what I like to showcase, because we're into productivity and managing endpoints really quickly, I'm going to link to credentials that are pre-existing in my vault.
Okay.
So I'm selecting those credentials. But as probably maybe you noticed, I'm doing this at the folder level.
Yeah. Instead of the interval entry.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we won't judge you if you reuse credentials across multiple endpoints.
Sure.
Depending on your security posture, it may be perfectly acceptable. And but for the ones at the other end of the spectrum, you're going to need to use privileged accounts and so on. But that works perfectly fine. But after I've done that, I'm going to have to say, you will guess it, that these computers must use my inherited credentials from their
the folder.
parent.
Yeah.
So I'm going to use a batch edit,
Okay.
and I'm going to tell all of them to use inherited credentials.
Okay. Wow.
All of these entries now use my inherited credentials. So
Yep.
let's connect to my trusty test machine, a nice tab interface.
Right.
Everything is self-contained. It follows. If you have more computers, focus is always following connections. You can extract that. You can run it in a external window. A lot of flexibility.
That's really cool.
It's really rich in features. But that's RDP. Maybe you're using switches. Maybe you're using Linux. So I'll import connections to Linux boxes. So this is not really complex entries. I'll show you, in fact, so you can recognize if you use, let's say, PuTTY, you'll recognize the settings that we have. So again, that same richness in settings, because you can use username, password authentication, private key authentication. You can open again as a prerequisite some type of connection, change the terminal, the keyboard bindings, and so on and so on and so on.
Wow. So a lot of flexibility and customizability too.
Yes.
Great.
So let's launch that SSH connection.
Perfect.
You see, password was
Injected automatically. Yep.
without bothering me, because that's not my day-to-day. My
Sure.
day is to work on these devices.
Yep. Not to manage a bunch of things in your head.
Yes.
So, absolutely.
But what I wanted to show you is that broadcasting to multiple screens, to multiple sessions. So obviously it's going to need to be SSH. So again, that time saver.
Okay.
Okay, so if I type sudo apt blah blah, you see it's there.
Oh, wow,
So
that's
if
really
I had
cool.
10 sessions established to 10 different switches,
Yeah.
I could do my updates. Obviously, this can be scripted. We have a type for that. So you just launch your connections. They can be in a playlist. You can launch a whole folder, a ton of options, and you can launch that connection, do your stuff, and in minutes you're done that part of your infrastructure, and you can move on to the next.
So it's a great task automation in a way, right?
And you forget about security because it's always there.
It's already
that
in there.
password. You never had to handle it. If it has been a private key, that private key is stored in that what we call a data source.
Absolutely.
Again, if you're moving to the enterprise edition with a centralized vault, so that private key is handled and managed by our system. So you store it, and obviously with a rich role-based access control system, you can grant permissions to see, use everything.
Wow, that's really good.
Yes, so that's one thing, and maybe for those of you that must handle VPNs, let's import that just to show that automation capability. And so this is my VPN client. I'm using a locally made app, but what is nice is I could have chosen Apple, Microsoft, OpenVPN, SonicWall, the Greenbow, TunnelClick. And so these are the ones that are built in.
Sure.
We do have a rich add-on ecosystem where you could add a bunch more. But what I'm using right now is a custom VPN. So let's say I want to close that and I want to modify it to use that VPN.
Okay.
Again, the key here is that your junior staff or a new hire needs to be productive as soon as possible.
Yep.
So I'm going to use a VPN that I've pre-configured. I'm going to choose, my favorite is connect if unable to ping or port scan.
Okay.
But for demonstration purposes, I'll choose always connect. I'll choose my VPN client. So now, if you imagine you're a service provider or you're a mobile warrior, you're not in the office, you want to launch to connect to that UBOO server.
Yep.
You just locate it, double click on it. Oh.
All right.
You see my VPN connection being established. Then I'm waiting. There are delays and so on that wait for the VPN to be established for sure. And then
boom,
connectivity is established. So that's all we could show you in the time we had.
Yeah.
Look, this is the free edition.
Oh, this is the free. Wow.
Yes.
Okay. So this is not even the paid version.
No.
So all this is what's included in the free.
Yes.
Wow, that's really
So
that's
the
amazing.
limitation we want to impose upon the free edition is to work with a team.
Sure.
So if you need to collaborate with someone, use a centralized database,
Yep.
you'll have to go for the enterprise edition. It's a great platform to showcase our capabilities.
Absolutely.
And we don't nag you. You haven't seen a pop-up, please upgrade to the paid version.
No. Absolutely.
So that's not really an upsell strategy in itself.
All right, thanks, Maurice, for that demo of our flagship software. But I know we have a few other solutions that integrate perfectly with this, and we just wanted to talk about them a little bit.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what else we have here.
Okay, so you saw that remote connection tool, Remote Desktop Manager. Obviously, we've handled passwords from the get-go.
Yeah.
But we do have other solutions. So we have that Devolutions Password Hub, which is an online solution. And we have, in the privilege access management space, we have that Devolutions Server, which is on-prem. But what does that mean in 2021? It's just that you run it in a virtual machine in a cloud of your choice.
Okay.
It just needs connectivity to your AD, Azure AD, whatever solution that we are supporting.
Perfect.
So that hub it's a SaaS-based solution.
Okay.
It's therefore available everywhere on the planet. It's for teams, or we have a free edition as well. We call it Hub Personal.
Yep.
But still, so it's a vault. So you share. You do have RBAC. We have audits. We have reports, And obviously, it integrates really nicely with Remote Desktop Manager.
Yeah. Yeah. You can use it as one of your vaults.
Yes.
Basically to get
Yes,
your credentials.
so that's for teams, for distributed teams, it's really amazing. For the highest grade security, this is our PAM, Privileged Access Management Solution. It's, again, I say on premises, but what does that mean?
Yeah.
One-click connection launch, AD, Azure AD, Office 365, is built upon Azure AD. Again, RBAC reports, but that's where you would get these checkout approval workflows and those limits and alerts and notifications and so on. So that's large enterprise.
Yeah.
Nowadays, medium businesses are using it.
Sure.
And we see small businesses like a managed service provider.
Yeah.
He has to justify to his medium business customer that he's using best practices and has cybersecurity in mind at all times.
Yeah.
So we are starting to deploy PAM solutions for small businesses that offer services to larger businesses.
Sure.
So that's pretty much it. We integrate with the top leaders in the Gartner quadrant in the PAM space. 160 technologies we integrate with.
Yeah.
So if you don't want your passwords in here, we'll use them wherever they are. Again, in the environment of that event today, it's how to improve security and so on. So our Devolution server has a Devolutions gateway built in, whereas it's called a jump box or a bastion server.
Yeah.
So you centralize connections through there. So the remote connection runs on the gateway.
Okay.
It does not run on the end user's computer. So that's, again, a heightened level of security because that person cannot interact in any way and perform something like lateral movement.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Maurice. I think this is very helpful. As we mentioned earlier as well, he's going to be in the chat, and he's going to. If you have any questions for him, please go ahead and ask him right now. And if you want to maybe look further into any of our solutions, you're more than welcome to go to our website, devolutions.net, but also talk to Maurice, and he'll love to book you a demo to really show you a little bit more in detail what we have to offer. All right. Well, thank you, Maurice, and have a wonderful rest of your conference. Thanks.
Hey everyone, welcome to my session today at the Get IT Endpoint Management one-day virtual conference. This session is going to be on how to use Windows Autopilot. So we'll talk you through what Autopilot exactly is, how you can get up and running with it, some of the gotchas, the various methods of doing it, and really give you that zero to hero overview of how you can get up and running with Windows Autopilot. Before we get into the weeds, a little bit about myself. My name is Rue Campbell. I've written for Petri.com for a little while now. You can find me on Twitter at RueCam365. I also run my own blog at campbell.scot. I'm a Microsoft Security Solutions architect by trade, mostly focus on the enterprise mobility security and Microsoft 365 Defender stacks. Enterprise mobility and security, obviously including Intune and device management, which is what this whole session's going to be about. I also run a YouTube channel, podcast, with my friend Pete Rising. We've also got a new guest, well, not really a guest, a new host with us, Kat Greenan, and you can find that just by searching Cloud Conversations on YouTube, and me invite all sorts of guests on there. We talk about Intune, we talk about security, device management, Teams, Power Automate, the whole shebang, so check that out. So let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about what Autopilot is and what it isn't, and in order to do that, we're going to compare it to the existing solutions that have been around with us for 10, 15, maybe even 20 years in some cases. Autopilot is all about provisioning your Windows devices in a modern way. Think about what we would call traditional imaging approaches to provisioning laptops, computers, things such as that. With an image, you maintain this gold standard, right, of here's what the device should look like for the user. And you have all these bits, the binaries, and you layer things on top of the operating system that you maintain. So that involves a regular update of that gold image to include the latest updates, the latest versions of your applications, things such as that. You then take all these different images that you have and you'll then apply drivers to them and things like that. So for example, if you've got a company that has 10 departments and 10 different types of device that you roll out, you could in theory end up with maybe up to 100 different images because you're managing all these different drivers and things like that. And that varies depending on what solution you're using to do your imaging, but it's a time intensive task, right, for you in IT. The problem that we've also found with that over the last, 2 years, especially since COVID, is that it doesn't scale well to this new remote work / hybrid work world, right? If you want folks to get these devices, they have to come from whomever you buy them from the supplier, go through your central IT team who provision them, and then you send it out to the end user. And in a lot of cases, you might even have IT teams that are logging in as that end user to set things up with them, to configure the account, to personalize things. And that kind of deviates from the best practice, right? Whereas we don't want anyone logging into an account that isn't theirs. Autopilot steps in and starts to change the game a little bit here. Autopilot is not an imaging solution, so that's one of the first misconceptions. It's close to it, but it's not an imaging. Autopilot differs from these imaging solutions insofar as it provisions an existing operating system that's on that device. When you buy your desktops, your laptops from the supplier, they will have what's generally called or regarded as the OEM version of Windows Pro or Enterprise. It might have some apps that the OEM has bundled in. Ideally, you don't want them, but it might come with that. But it sits there, right, and it waits for you to provision it. So we're not deploying an operating system here. We're using the binaries, the bits of the operating system that are already there. We can use them in recovery partitions and things like that, to then just take Windows as it's installed and build on it. The kinds of things we do with it are what you would normally try to achieve with your imaging solution. So we're going to be able to deploy apps, we're going to be able to deploy settings, we're going to be able to deploy policies, and we target those to Azure Active Directory groups via mobile device management solution, which is typically Intune, but we'll get into that later on. The real advantage from Autopilot is in the end result that gives us, because we're using an MDM to push down apps, push down settings. For your perspective, that means it's serverless. You don't have to run around managing servers that have images that are distributed over something like Pixie. You don't have to have USB sticks and sit there and wait for it to copy over and all that kind of thing. Because we're using an MDM, the device can go straight from the supplier, bypass your IT team, and go straight to the end user. The end user gets their device, they sign in, authenticate that to that device, and it provisions it over the internet. So that's the kind of brave new world that we're going into here. And the idea is that it's going to save your IT team time, and it's going to allow you to more effectively get devices up to date and in the hands of your users. Let's talk a little bit about how this all fits into what Microsoft and some others call this modern device lifecycle. So again, we'll recap. What is the exact scenario here that Autopilot fulfills? You can buy a batch of laptops, desktops from your OEM, your vendor, your supplier. Those can be delivered straight to the end user, who will then open the laptop, for example, connect to Wi-Fi, authenticate with an Azure AD account, and as they do that, the MDM then sees, okay, well, here's all these rules that this device has to follow, here's all these apps it has to install, so let's push all that down to the user. So they go away, make a cup of coffee as the laptop sits there provisioning, they come back, boom, they're good to go. And you saved all that time of having to send it through the IT team, having to load things by USB, because it's all coming down from the MDM. The other scenario that this Autopilot and Intune together will help facilitate is the ongoing lifecycle of the device. So within your MDM, you could then reset the device so that as it goes from user A to user B, it goes back to that nice clean slate for user B to then get the device and go through the process again. So again, it doesn't have to go back to that IT team if you don't want it to. So it's all about improving efficiencies and being able to do all this over the internet, which over the last 2 years, 18 months, is kind of proven to be very important in our line of work. There are a bunch of ways that you can use Autopilot. So again, it's all about provisioning these devices. The most obvious one, the one that I've really been discussing so far, is what we call user-driven mode. And that's where the device goes straight to the end user, they authenticate, it pulls down all the settings in the apps, and boom, they're good to go. That's the nice, plain, simple Autopilot, and it's what most folks would associate with Autopilot. There's also a mode called self-deploying mode, and what self-deploying mode allows you to do is automatically provision a device for these kiosk scenarios, as Microsoft like to call them. And that's typically where you're stepping into the realm of where you don't have a relationship of one-to-one with devices to users. So this could be library scenarios, reception scenarios, hot desking scenarios, or digital signage, where it's not clear cut and saying user A has computer 1. You know, these things are being used by multiple users who may be signing in and out, and therefore we want to have different rules applied to them. We might want to clear down the profile cache after the user signs out. We might not even want to have anyone have to sign in. It could be as soon as the device boots, it loads Edge, loads a web page, that kind of scenario there. Autopilot can completely support that as well. Third mode is what's called pre-provisioning mode, formerly known as white glove. That's a name that Microsoft they had to change it because it's Microsoft. So they call it pre-provisioning because what that allows you to do is keep that, dare I say, middleman stage of the device going through an IT department or maybe even a third party. So what does that achieve? The device, rather than going from the supplier to the end user, goes through this middle stage that we call pre-provisioning, and it really lets the user save a lot of time in the end, because what we're going to be able to do is preload a bunch of apps and settings that would normally be downloaded by the end user after they authenticate. We can download them first so that when the user then signs in, all the apps and things are already there. It's really just a time-saving method for the user, but it might also allow your IT team to do some preparation for the device with regards to things like asset management tags, barcode stickers, things such as that. You might not yet be in a place where you can send the device straight to that end user. There's also a tool that you get with Autopilot registered devices called Autopilot Reset, and that allows you to set that device back to kind of a known good condition where you could then hand that device over to another user, as an example. The last method that we're going to touch on briefly, and this isn't the official name, it doesn't really have an official name, is what we call the JSON method. So a JSON, just to clarify that, that's kind of like a text file, little configuration file, a few KB in size, and that contains some parameters, so rules. And the JSON method allows you to use Autopilot on devices that may not typically support the Autopilot scenario. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the demo and you see what kind of scenarios that might help facilitate. One such example would be Windows 7 or Windows 8 upgrades to Windows 10, because Windows 7 and Windows 8, they don't support Autopilot. So, talk you through a few key things that are important to know before we get into the demonstrations, because that's what you're really going to learn. Seeing as picture paints 1,000 words, right? First thing, licensing. I know it's boring, but we have to talk about it. It's Microsoft at the end of the day. Your users, to provision these Autopilot devices, they have to be licensed to both Azure Active Directory, Premium P1, and Microsoft Intune. Now, those are included in a whole bunch of larger subscriptions, such as Enterprise Mobility and Security E3 or Microsoft 365 E3, or you can also license those standalone. Maybe not worth it in terms of cost to do both of those standalone. You might save a couple pennies. Typically, you'd be looking at EMS E3 or Microsoft 365 E3 at a minimum for Autopilot to fully be supported. When we get to the demo, this will become much more apparent, but there is a concept and a piece of jargon really within the Autopilot world called the hardware hash. And this is a key piece of information that lets Intune know which tenant your device belongs to. So think of a hardware hash as kind of like a serial number. It's got a whole bunch of different names, and the names have changed over time. No comment. So we'll keep calling it the hardware hash, but essentially think of this as a combination of a whole bunch of hardware serial numbers run through an algorithm that puts out a big long serial number. So for example, the unique CPU in your device, the unique memory, the solid state drive, all these different pieces of hardware information make a device completely unique in the world, right? And then we take all that information, we upload it to your tenant. That could be petri.com. And then when the device boots up, it connects to the Autopilot service and it says, hey, this device belongs to petri.com. It has this Autopilot rule set to follow. We're going to download those Autopilot rules and then prompt the user to authenticate. So when we talk about hardware hash, that's what links the device to a tenant within Microsoft 365. I've seen comparisons where it's kind of like Find My Friends, where you're saying on an iPhone, where you're saying this iPhone belongs to this account. It's not a million miles away from that. One key thing to clarify as well is there'll be a lot of use of the words Autopilot and Intune throughout this session. They're actually separate products. Autopilot is a Windows feature that will let you support any other MDM. So Intune is what's called an MDM. It manages the device, it pushes down apps, pushes down settings, reports things back to you. Autopilot is, I call it a bootstrapper. I think that's a nice way of describing it, insofar as it's what gets the device up and running, and then Intune takes over. So Autopilot itself does not push down apps, does not push down settings. That's the work of Intune. And when we get into the demonstration, we'll do a run through so you can see what the user experience looks like, and I'll call out the exact time when Autopilot has finished its work and then Intune picks up its work. I make a point with most folks who are looking to get into Autopilot to work very closely with your supplier of laptops. One, because the key selling point of Autopilot, quite frankly, is that your devices can go straight to the end user. So we want to make that process as clean and efficient as possible. So number one, your vendor, your supplier, those hardware hashes I mentioned, they will be able to send those straight into your tenant automatically. That's what enables the whole vendor to end user direct relationship. The other thing you want to talk to your vendor about is providing clean Windows 10 images. So for example, we might want to get rid of some of the apps that some of the big vendors put in their laptops. I'm not going to name names, but you guys know that there are some vendors out there. You open up a laptop straight from this manufacturer and it's full of bloatware, is the nice way to refer to it, right? We want to get as clean an image as possible, and they will give it to you if you ask for them. Some of them might charge you pennies more, but it is an option with all of them. Another thing that you want to liaise with your vendor from, whoever you buy these devices from, is talk to them about pre-provisioning. A lot of those guys will manage that for you, and they'll also do asset tagging for you. So for example, if you do need to stick a label on that laptop to say this is the property of our corporation, or a barcode that can be scanned that maps to your asset management systems, you can work with them. In a lot of these businesses, they will actually charge a little bit on top of the price of the laptop, but they'll do it for you. And again, it enables that scenario with the device going straight from whom you purchase it to all the way to that end user. And then lastly, Oh, hybrid Azure AD join. This is a little bit out of scope for this session because this is all about talking about how does Autopilot work. But it supports two types of Active Directory join. It supports Azure AD join, which is where the computer goes straight into Azure AD, doesn't touch the on-prem AD, or you can do hybrid Azure AD join. There's a little bit of controversy about this. It's not always well explained in the literature that Microsoft put out in the documentation, but frankly, there are so few circumstances where for new devices or re-provision devices that you will need to choose hybrid Azure AD mode instead of Azure AD mode. They're few and far between. There's a couple, but on the whole, you can almost always do Azure AD join. So stick with that as your best option. And I'm sure in the future, we'll talk more about that. We'll write more about that on petri.com. Okay, so let's get into the weeds with this thing. Let's do a demonstration of what Autopilot looks like for the end user. We'll emulate a new device that's going through Autopilot, and as that's happening in the background, we'll jump over to Microsoft Endpoint Manager, into Azure AD as well, and we'll show you what you need to do to get it all to work. So let's jump over. Now I'm going to be using a virtual machine here. This is really just obviously to emulate what would happen on the physical device. It's going to look largely the same, and I'll try and call out any differences. So before I hit this power on virtual machine button, think of this as basically being identical to me being an end user. I've just got my laptop, it's Autopilot ready, you've set it up in the background, and it's my first day at work. So let's go, let's see what it looks like. So I'll power it on. Now, virtual machines are kind of by their nature are always going to be connected to an Ethernet, right? So this is going to might be slightly different from an end user doing this at home. Your end user at home probably is not going to be hooked up by Ethernet. They might, but they probably won't. They're probably going to be using Wi-Fi. So as an end user at home, what will happen is Windows will ask me, hey, what language do you speak? What keyboard do you need? What Wi-Fi do you want to connect to? You're not going to see that in this demo here because we're hooked up by Ethernet, so it doesn't need to ask me what Wi-Fi do I want to connect to. And also, because I'm hooked up by Ethernet, it can actually retrieve my language settings from the Autopilot profile. And when we get to the admin run through, you'll see what that looks like. However, this is only applicable on an Ethernet scenario. What you'll also see here is the device is currently undergoing a reboot. So I turned it on, it immediately rebooted. Now it's starting up again. Why did that happen? The Autopilot process often does something called a 0-day patch, which is a mandatory patch that is applied to these Windows 10 images as soon as they get online. So let's get rid of that little VMware pop-up. And what you will see here is we're connecting to the internet, and all of a sudden we see what's called the out-of-box experience, which is this familiar blue screen that often has Cortana blaring at you. But what we actually see here is it's customized to my organization, right? Welcome to Contoso. Now, if I went to Walmart, PC World, Curry's, any kind of hardware store, computer store, and bought this laptop, I obviously wouldn't see that. Why am I seeing it? Because what has happened in the background is my device is connected to the internet. It's looked at the hardware hash of my device. We've connected to the Autopilot service in the cloud. We've seen, hey, this computer belongs to Contoso. Let's download the Autopilot profile for Contoso and then present it. So here we go. This is what's powering this on in the background. It's that hardware hash that links it to my organization and the Autopilot profile. So what I now do as the end user, I authenticate. First of all, before I authenticate, let's check the domain we've got here. There we go. So I will authenticate as a standard user. So this is not an admin account. This is going to be any standard user in your organization's account who's licensed and set up accordingly. Let's just punch this in. This is a ridiculously long and hard to remember Microsoft demonstration tenant email address. So I'll just punch that in. Hopefully I got it right. Looks like I did. Now, before I hit the enter key to proceed here, and I'm pretty sure I put that password in wrong, so let's go for it again. Couple notes here. This is authenticating to Azure Active Directory, the same account that powers Office 365 and will power a whole bunch of other things for you guys. The interesting thing here is all the security benefits of Azure AD will also apply to this Autopilot process. I'm talking about conditional access, I'm talking about multi-factor authentication, and I'm talking about passwordless. So if you have any of those set up, those are all compatible with this. It could prompt me for MFA through conditional access. If I've set up passwordless, I could sign in with a temporary access pass and set up passwordless using phones or using FIDO keys or something like that. Additionally, it won't happen in this demonstration because I've turned it off due to the nature of a virtual machine. We can also get the user set up for Windows Hello for Business all through this process. So I'm going to authenticate to here. Now, as I authenticate, a couple of things are happening. I mentioned that there's a certain point during this process where Autopilot has finished its work and then Intune picks up its work. This is that moment here. What is happening is Autopilot has finished, and you might be watching this thinking, that was quick. And the answer is, it is quick. Autopilot for the end user kind of doesn't do that much. When we get into the admin side of it, you'll see there's not that much to configure for what Autopilot does on these new devices. What does it do? It skips the user having to accept things such as the Windows 10 licensing agreement and the privacy options. It points it to a tenant, and then there's a couple other things it does, but you'll see there it was really just putting that fast forward button on it and giving the user a guided path through what's called the out-of-box experience. So, I know what you're thinking now. Okay, well, if that's Autopilot done, what is Intune doing now, right? Because we're now onto the Intune stage. Intune is currently displaying what's called an enrollment status page, or an ESP, and this is a page that you can configure. You can customize it, but you can generally configure it to completely lock out the user until that device is good to go for that user. And we break an enrollment status page down into 3 chunks. The stage that it's at just now is called device preparation. And if I hit show details, we can see it working on a few things. Now, you'll see this for device prep, device setup, and account setup. It shows us these 4 sub-stages within these 3 larger stages. The wording of them's a little bit bizarre. It doesn't exactly match up to things that you might think it match up to. But essentially what we're doing in this device preparation stage is we're taking that device and we are joining it into Azure Active Directory, and we're joining it into Intune. So we're saying Intune as an MDM provider is going to be in control of this device. Why is that important? Because it empowers it to go into the next stages called device setup. Intune is where we manage things such as security policies, certificates, general settings, and then also apps. So for example, within Intune, we can go on and we can say, here's the Defender antivirus rules. Here's the custom wallpaper, the custom start menu, all that kind of stuff. And then also we can package applications. These applications might belong to the Microsoft Store for Business, or they might just be standard exe and MSI files that we can package and upload into Intune as well. So all that stuff that imaging typically did for you, this is what Autopilot, well, what Intune can now do as well. And you'll see here we're in device setup stage. The account setup stage is going to be very similar to this, and really it just depends on how we've targeted the settings, the configuration, and the apps. So for example, within group policy, you might be familiar with the idea that you target policy to computers or users. Kind of the same here. Not exactly, but kind of. Insofar as these are the apps that have been set to the device scope. When that's finished, it will go on to the apps and settings that have been set to the user scope. And when you're targeting things in Intune, think about how that device is going to be used, provisioned, and then how the user is going to travel with that device. If a user is hopping between 5 PCs a week, do we want the apps to always be following the user, or do we want them to be static on the device so that if lots of users use that device, they all get the app? That's the kind of design decision we have to make. So what's going to happen here is this is going to take a little bit of time. It's currently installing some applications. So what I will do is I'm going to let this tick away in the background. Touch wood, hopefully the demo gods are on my side. And I'm going to jump into Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which is where we manage all this, and show you how all this came to be. Let's get that over on the screen now. So we're in Microsoft Endpoint Manager. On the left hand side here, and tell you what, I'll zoom that in, make it a little bit easier to read. We'll go to Devices, we'll go to Windows, and then there's this option here called Windows Enrollment. So let's talk through a couple things here, because everything I've mentioned falls back to here where we actually configure it. Let's start from the beginning. If I click on Devices, this is going to show me devices that are what we'd call Autopilot devices or Autopilot registered devices. Remember that hardware hash that I mentioned where you take that, kind of a device serial number and upload it to your tenant? This is where it ends up. I'm in a demo tenant, so I've just got my virtual machine. Practically, you would end up with a lot of these, and the serial numbers would actually be the serial number that's on the device. So for example, if you've got a Dell serial number on the bottom of your Dell Latitude, just as an example, that would show up there. So this is where we can see what devices are owned, in a sense, by our tenant. You'll also see this profile status assigned column. I'll come back to that, but ultimately that's what controls the rules of Autopilot. Purchase order. I didn't purchase this virtual machine. However, if I'd gone through this process with a supplier who had given me a purchase order number at the time, that could get linked into here and I could see what batch of laptops that was associated with. And then there's also a column here called group tag. Now this is an important column because it's kind of a free text column that allows us to control things such as membership to groups. So as an example, if I put in here a group tag of finance or factory or HR, what I could then do is I could create up an Azure AD group in the background, and I could say if the group tag contains finance, put it in this Azure Active Directory group called finance. And the great thing about that is it then lets me target policies to it, so I don't have to go in and manually add the device to the finance group. It automatically ends up there, and if I have finance applications that the finance team need, they will automatically be installed in that group. So we'll jump back to Windows here. So that's where the hardware hashes and all that comes into play. I mentioned it said profile assigned, right? Let's jump into this section here, deployment profiles. I've only got one in this demonstration. Let's go in here. So what kind of stuff are we doing in this Autopilot profile? Again, Autopilot didn't really look like it did much, right? It showed me a login screen. I logged in, and then I told you that Intune took over, right? The reason it didn't look like Autopilot did much was because Autopilot really just exists to kind of automate and hold your user's hand through a lot of that out-of-box experience. How so? So to start with, it automatically controlled the language. I mentioned earlier I didn't have to choose the language because I was hooked up by Ethernet. It just threw the language in there automatically. I didn't have to accept any software license terms, didn't have to accept any privacy settings. It also chose to provision my account as a standard user. Now, the other type of user I could have been would be an administrator. I've written about this before in Petri. We want to minimize the number of local admins in an environment, obviously, but that is an option. Allow white glove, that's the process I mentioned earlier. It's funny how Microsoft changed the names of these things but don't update the UI. This is now called pre-provisioning, and that's where, let me see if I can jump back to the virtual machine. It looks like it's getting ahead of itself, so I won't be able to show you there. But that device setup stage, where it was installing apps and settings at the device level, that's what the pre-provisioning would have allowed us to do for the user. Automatically configure keyboard. I didn't get asked to configure a keyboard, that's because Autopilot did it for me. And then apply device name template. Now I'll just straight up call this as one of the, honestly, one of the main shortcomings that a lot of customers I work with on Autopilot identify is this naming template. Insofar as you can see, what can we do here? We can use a serial number. We can use some random characters. And that's about it. So if you've got any kind of advanced naming convention for your Autopilot, well, what before were your Autopilot devices, you might need to rethink that when you go to use Autopilot. One of the reasons it's maybe not such a problem if you do have those advanced naming conventions is that with Intune you can go straight from a user to the device. So if a user phones up and you're normally saying, okay, well, what department are they in, what office are they in, to try and find their device name within your system, you can instead just say, hi, what's your name, go to their user profile, and then jump straight to the device that's associated with them. So that's one reason that it's maybe not as important. But I will do totally sympathise with anyone that does think that that's maybe not so good. Okay, so we talked about deployment profiles, we talked about devices. The enrollment status page, that's that page where, you know, the blue screen that said, hey, we're installing apps, we're installing settings. If I jump in and show you how that's configured, we can choose to have different enrollment status pages for different users and devices. So for example, let's say I'll pick on finance again. We've got a finance team. Let's say they get 2 applications. So I know that's not going to take a lot of time. I might have a different timeout value for Autopilot failure for that team than I may have for a marketing team who are getting Photoshop and maybe a number of big applications. That's the kind of reason you might want to have different enrollment status pages for different folks. And you can also say, rather than holding that enrollment status page over the device before the user gets in, what we could actually say as well, if the user is being giving 20 applications or something quite sizable like that, what we might prefer to do is we'll say, okay, well, of that big batch of applications, 5 of them are core applications. Therefore, all we're going to do is hold it back until the core applications are installed. So in this example, I could say only hold it back until Office 365 is installed. What will happen then is Office 365 installs, the user gets their desktop, and everything else just installs in the background as they go about using the device. It's not appropriate for all scenarios, but it might be appropriate for some. One of the last things I'll show you within this Windows enrollment page, which is again where we're setting all this stuff to allow the devices to provision, is this MDM scope. So this is a prerequisite. Out the box, you may find this is set to none. If it's set to none, essentially what it's doing is telling you that none of your users will be able to automatically find the MDM that your tenant is set up with. So what we're going to do is we're going to set that to some. Maybe if we don't want everyone to use this, we could set it to some. But in most cases, we can set it to all. So those are the prerequisites. All those things that I just showed you, those are kind of the building blocks of Autopilot and device provisioning with Intune. I'll give you a wee bit of an overview of Intune if you're not familiar with it as well, just while that VM is still provisioning. But what I'll do is I'll jump into applications, and we can see here some of the applications I've used in this example. Adobe Reader, standard exe file. We take that, we run it through a packaging system, and then we upload it. You can go on Petri.com and you can search for Intune Win32 packaging. I've written a guide that will show you how to do all that. Some of these applications, Office 365 apps, Microsoft Edge, there's actually a built-in wizard within Intune, so you don't need to package those. You just say Office 365 on this update cycle with these parts of the Office 365 suite, these apps, and it will do that all automatically for you. We can also integrate with the Microsoft Store for Business and therefore automatically push down apps from the Microsoft Store. In this example, what I've actually done is I've taken the Mail and Calendar app from the Microsoft Store for Business, and I've said, rather than installing it, I'm actually going to uninstall it. So I know a lot of folks out there one of the things they do for their users is they take away a lot of the Microsoft Store apps that are already built in to Windows. Top of my head, mail and calendar, solitaire, film and movies, those kind of applications. You can just uninstall them as part of that process as well. There we go. So we can see here, we're currently waiting for the account setup to finish. Looks like it might be done in a minute. So oh, there we go. There's my desktop. I'll give it a minute just because the VM is going to run a little bit slow. I'll jump back here. And the other thing we can control within Intune for our newly provisioned devices are these things called configuration profiles. And these are kind of the customizations, the policies, the settings, things such as that. Wallpapers and lock screens, start menu layout, taskbar layout. We can enable Edge single sign-on, OneDrive single sign-on, and a whole bunch of other things, including, again, limiting that local admin access, which again, if you search on Petri.com, you can find another article on how to control local admins using Intune on Azure AD joined devices. So that's how it's all set up in the background. There are things I'm omitting in the interest of time, but that's a general overview of how it all works. It's all web-based. It's all, from your perspective, serverless as well. And here we go. The device is up and good to go. I'll go to the start menu. Here we go. We can see a configuration profile that I've set up has set a custom start menu. The apps that I deployed are there. Excel is there. Edge will have updated if it wasn't. The company portal is also there. Now, if Intune is new to you, the company portal I kind of like to describe as the Intune app, and it also provides an internal app store for your users. So for example, if you don't want to force down apps, but you do want to make them available to a user, you can use the company portal, and you can just say, hey, go into the company portal to install this application on demand. We call that making applications available. And you can see here we're just pushing down all these things, including, if I missed it there, yeah, there you go, Adobe Acrobat DC. So this is the kind of apps that we can push down. There is a limit of, I hope I don't get this wrong, I want to say 8 gigabytes. Someone can fact check me in the comments for our 132 apps that we put into Intune, but that's going to cover almost all types of application. And here we go. So we went from a completely unprovisioned device straight out the box, straight from the vendor, and now I'm good to go. I can jump in, I can open all my Office apps, go into File Explorer. OneDrive is currently getting ready in the background, and what I can actually see is as well, if I go to my OneDrive, I can actually see it's pulling down all that, and it's also got known folder move enabled, as I can tell by the desktop also being synced there. So again, this is just a nice clean way of pushing out new devices to your end users. Hopefully that was informative to you. Autopilot and Intune are big subjects. There's a lot to learn. That's a high level overview with a little bit of demonstration of what it can achieve for you and your business. If you get any questions, you can find me, well, in the chat on the YouTube stream. You can also find me on Twitter, RuCam365. Just drop me a message, well, drop me a tweet. Any questions, happy to answer them. Also anything that you're interested in learning how to do in Intune, give me a heads up and we'll try and get some stuff on Petri for that. So, like I said, hopefully that's been informative to you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.
Welcome to Petri's Get IT Endpoint Management One-Day Virtual Conference. For this hour block, I will be your host, Michael Reinders. I have been a Petri contributor since early 2021 and have over 20 years of experience in the world of professional information technology. My primary goal is to assist users, IT pros, and company C-level positions with how to add value via IT and to help boost productivity across organizations. You can contact me on Twitter at mdreinders. I'm available on LinkedIn and also my email address. So I'm going to talk today about managing Windows updates. There are two main types of updates, two main programs, infrastructure roles per se, you can use to manage your devices, Windows updates. There are on-premise solutions, and then there are Microsoft Cloud solutions. I'm going to focus on the more traditional and highly prevalent on-premise solutions to give you hands-on direct management of all aspects of updating your devices with Windows Update. The first option I'll be going through is called WSUS, which stands for Windows Server Update Services. It's a relatively straightforward role that you can install and add to any modern and supported Windows Server installation. You can install it on Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2, 2016, 2019, and the brand new 2022. And side note, you can also install this on Windows Server Core if you so choose, which is actually recommended by Microsoft. Alright, the second option is called Windows Update for Business. This is basically, this utilizes also two different options in its configuration, using either group policy objects in your on-premise Active Directory environment, or you can also use Microsoft Intune, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Admin Center to manage the aspect of Windows Update for Business. I will be focused on the group policy option and walking you through how to set up the rings of devices. Basically, a ring of device is the priority of that device. How stable does that device have to be? Maybe for some C-level executives, it needs to be stable, where you might wait a month, defer updates for 30 days, which I'll show you in the Windows Update GUI later on, so that they have something more baked. So maybe on September's Patch Tuesday, when it's released, these class of devices will get these patches a month later. So on the October Patch Tuesday, essentially, or any time and date you want to determine, you'll receive prior month's patches that have had longer time to bake, and also possibly patches that have been updated or resolved in issues that were discovered after they were released. So that's Windows Update for Business. And then the third item I'll be going through is just showing you the Windows Update GUI, the settings, and just looking over the various settings in there in terms of deferring updates. And a lot of the devices and settings you'll see in the GUI is what WSUS and Windows Update for Business will essentially take over. So once these group policy settings or the WSUS group policy settings are in place, you'll be able to see on the client side in the GUI where there are some changes, some things that you grayed out, and it'll say across the top, some settings here, I forget what the exact wording is, but some settings here are managed by your administrator. So let's get started talking about WSUS. Again, WSUS stands for Windows Server Update Services. So it's installed as a role on Windows Server operating systems, similar to Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS, DNS, Print Server. So this allows you to very easily make it an easy task to install. You basically have the option of using Server Manager, which has been around since, I believe, Server Manager's been around since I think 2003, if not earlier. You can also use PowerShell to install it, and you can also use Windows Admin Center to remotely install this tool. Incidentally, in terms of remote, you can also remotely use Server Manager to install the role, and actually use PowerShell to install it remotely. So a lot of configuration options, but I'll be going through installing Server Manager right on a server. So the software is managed via the traditional and ever so legacy MMC admin tool that's installed when you install the server role. And you can also use the more modern Windows Admin Center to actually handle the management of WSUS. So what WSUS does is, instead of your devices going out independently to the internet to download the latest Windows updates that are released traditionally on Patch Tuesday, the second Tuesday of the month, this actually is a single point on your network that will synchronize the installed updates with everything that's new on Microsoft's Windows Update servers. So traditionally it's done overnight just to save on your internet bandwidth, not to impact your users' use of it. Basically, whatever categories and device classifications you choose to get updates for is what will be downloaded. So you can restrict it to just, if you're a Windows 10 shop, you can just check Windows 10, and it will only download the patches and driver files applicable to Windows 10. So even inside the device classification you choose, you can also choose security updates, feature updates, pre-release feature updates, so you have a lot of options there. Basically, which gives you complete control over what patches get installed. So once WSUS is enabled and it's configured in group policy, and your clients receive these group policy registry settings, they will not get any updates installed until you, as an administrator in WSUS, approve them. And again, all AD joined devices will automatically be configured via group policy, assuming you run through the steps correctly. And of course, there's always chances for human error, but we'll hopefully make note of those and catch them before they happen. So let me go briefly over Windows Update for Business. So Windows Update for Business, a free service that is available for all the premium editions of Windows 10, as Microsoft likes to call them, Windows 10 Pro, Enterprise, Pro for Workstations, and the Education editions. So this is a little different of a deployment manager of Windows updates. So basically, we again control what types and categories of patches are approved for your devices. But instead of using WSUS, which is a software tool, this is essentially just using group policy to kind of put a blanket over that Windows Update GUI, like I mentioned. So it'll configure based on, again, the rings that you choose on what devices get what updates when. You want to defer, like, so your first tier, which might be your development ring or canary ring or fast ring, they might get patches installed day one of Patch Tuesday. And that will give you a few days, or however number of days you wish, to make sure there aren't any issues that are affecting the devices in your environment, and gives you a chance to let those bake. So your second ring could be the maybe slow ring, or release preview, where maybe 7 days has gone by, you let a week go by, and now, assuming there are no issues with what the development branch got, now your next pool of devices can get these because they are stable and they're meant to be broadened out to a larger set of devices. And then, as just an example, your third ring could be your stable ring, and maybe that's either 15 days or 20 days or even 30 days. Like I mentioned earlier, you can have a 30-day deference of those patches, so that your CEO and CIO and CFO, let's say they get the patches a month after Patch Tuesday, so that it's been a whole month that those patches and security updates have been baked, tested, worked through your environment. Any application gotchas are discovered and resolved, and if they aren't, in case they can't be, you can always pause these updates. So those getting those updates a month later just provides a more stable environment for those devices in terms of robustness and reliability. And again, this is using group policy. We'll go through all the settings that you can use, how to get the administrative templates updated on your DCs if applicable. And again, this manages all the aspects of the complete delivery process. When patches are released, when they're installed, and when they're rebooted, and how much control you want to give these devices and users that use these. Alright, the third thing I'll be going through is Windows Update, the GUI in the settings program in Windows 10. Basically showing just the high level of what you see there in terms of what check for updates means. When you check, when you have WSUS enabled, like I said, in group policy, you'll see a new link because one of the buttons will check against your WSUS server, and one of the links will check against the Microsoft Internet. So you can choose if you want users to even have that ability to go to the Internet, or if it needs to be controlled, you can hide that GUI item in the Windows Update box. So basically talking about feature updates, what quality updates are, what driver updates are, optional driver updates, going through the various options you have, showing the update history, advanced options, and then again how when WSUS is enabled in your environment via group policy objects, how that affects the status and behavior of the Windows Update dialog. I'll also be touching on the Windows Insider program and how that can be incorporated at a high level for your org. There are other, there's a Windows Insider program for business that's not going to be covered here, but I can definitely chat about that briefly. And then give you advanced knowledge about how does Windows 11 play differently in this environment. So we'll find out. Well, that is my slideshow for today, and I am going to pass it over to myself, Michael Reinders, and walk you through a couple demos of how this software works. So I'll be right back. And welcome back to the conference. This is the demo phase. My name again is Michael Reinders. I'll be going through demoing a high-level overview of the installation of WSUS and how to look to your client machines. So what we're going to do is start with a nice fresh Windows Server 2019 server named WS19-WSUS-01. So what we can do is go to the server manager, and as WSUS is a role, we're going to go ahead and wait until the lovely discovery phase is complete, and click Add Roles and Features. And click Next to allow its default options. We're choosing to administer this local server. And we're going to scroll down to the bottom of the roles list and choose Windows Server Update Services. This will prompt an automatic addition of features, including some .NET Framework, the RSAT tools, and IIS, which is used for the back end of the client-server communication. And also we're going to be choosing to use the simple Windows internal database to house the configuration of WSUS. Add features, click Next, and we're going to assume the defaults here, click Next. This just tells you that WSUS needs at least one WSUS server to have access to the Microsoft Update service. And here, WSUS Services is the core services for WSUS. WID connectivity, that's Windows internal database, that is the simpler lower end database engine we're going to use. You also have the option of using a remote SQL Server database engine as your repository for the WSUS configuration. This brilliant installer does not allow for you to browse out to a location to store the updates that the server will download from Microsoft. So let's go ahead and create our own local folder on the C drive called WSUS content. Copy and paste that right into this configuration screen. And this just says that IIS is going to be installed, and here are the optional features that IIS needs to run. Click Next. We'll check the start box to restart the server. I don't think it's necessary, but I'll go ahead and click Install. And I'll, for the courtesy of time, pause the recording during the install. Okay, the post installation is complete. I'm going to click Close. And as you can see, WSUS is now installed role, but we need to go through some configuration steps. So I'm going to click this warning indicator, launch post-installation tasks, which as you can see doesn't always launch. So what I can do is open up Windows Administrative Tools, scroll down to Windows Server Update Services, and this will prompt me to run those tasks. Again, we're going to store the updates locally, and here's the location that we chose to store the updates. This shouldn't take too long. This is just, I believe, configuring the database, making sure the schema is up to date and valid. Let's see. Okay, completed. So that is complete, and now we're going to be prompted through the configuration wizard. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. There are a couple. This is a very straightforward internet infrastructure I have in my Hyper-V lab. But in your relatively more complex environment, you may have obviously you're going to have hardware firewall. You may have security measures implementing software-based firewalls. You just need to configure and make sure that the necessary ports are open for the WSUS server to access the internet, and for clients to be able to access IIS on this server. Those are pretty straightforward. Click Next. We can choose to join the illustrious Microsoft Update Improvement Program. So here, basically, we're going to synchronize updates from the internet, from the Microsoft Update server. If you would happen to have multiple WSUS servers, you can designate one as the master, which will be the one to download from the internet, and then subsequent servers you install, you can simply point to this server to synchronize its local database to the master. We don't need to use a proxy server in this situation, which is good. So now this is going to start, I'm going to start connecting. This is going to download the latest database of all the different device classifications, product classifications, Windows, Office, Visual Studio, that kind of thing. And that's also going to download the different types of updates, meaning drivers, feature updates, security updates, critical updates. I'll pause the recording as this sometimes takes a while. Stand by. Okay, we have completed. Let's click Next. So here's where you can choose languages. If you know for sure that you only use English regional settings and language packs with Windows, you can keep English. But you can add obviously other languages, and to be completely thorough, you would choose the first option to download all languages. So this is where we choose which products we want to install, want to download updates for. There are many, but to avoid there being so many updates, at least just for purposes of this, I'm going to choose just the most recent Windows client. Keep that on there. Dynamic update, phone creators. I don't know if those are needed. There's a lot of optional things. Normally in a regular setting, it's okay to leave these all selected, but just again to avoid a large initial synchronization, I'm just going to trim this down. Windows 10, you don't need Windows 2000, you don't need Windows 7. Yes, you don't need Windows 8, Waypoint 1. Windows Insider pre-release, so that would actually include, like Windows 21H2, Windows 10 21H2 that's due this fall. And also the Windows 11, which should be available with this category selection. Turn off all these other items. Turn off all the server products. And yes, there are a lot. Windows Server. Ultimate extras. Now I'm going back to Vista days, and no, I don't have any Windows Vista or Windows XP items in my lab here. Alright, so again, a lot of those things would actually be selected, but just for this demo purpose, we're going to choose this. The default usually is okay, so critical updates, security updates, upgrades, like upgrades to Windows 10, 21H2, Windows 11 would be in that overall category. Drivers is one of the main options I would recommend thinking about and checking so that your users don't have the possibility of downloading a bad driver or a driver that might cause an issue before you have time to test it via WSUS. So we'll just we'll leave it off for this purpose. I'm going to choose to synchronize manually because it does take a long time, but here you typically synchronize automatically, 1 a.m., 11 p.m., whatever's a off time for your internet connection. And I will begin the initial synchronization now and definitely pause the video as this can take a long time to download. We'll click finish, and this describes the other steps we'll go through briefly: creating computer groups, assigning computers to those groups using group policy, and there's also an optional option to add auto approval rules. So if you want to, so to speak, or for example, all critical updates you want to just automatically approve. You don't want to have a WSUS administrator go into the interface and approve those. That is an option for you. So I clicked finish, and I'm going to click on this new server. And we'll just maximize this for now. And it says to view available updates, you need to synchronize. So I'm going to go to the synchronizations panel, and we can see there's one running right now. And again, this will take a while, so I will now pause the video. All right, so we're back. Actually, the first synchronization takes a very long time. So I'm going to resume the configuration steps. So the next step is to create the group policy object that clients will see to know to go to the WSUS server when checking for updates versus the internet. So we're going to right-click on our domain, create a new object, let's say WSUS config. Oh, demo name already exists. I think I did that in my demo. So here's WSUS config 01. So what we'll do, right-click on that and go to edit. So we're going to open up, and this is a computer configuration, so we're going to go to policies, administrative templates, Windows components, and all the way to the bottom, Windows update. So the two primary ones that are necessary, which I'll go through, configure automatic updates. So we're going to enable automatic updates, and I'm going to choose, there's several options here you can read about. I'm going to choose 4, auto download and schedule the install. So, and the rest of these settings are actually fine. I'll check install updates. So clients, when they check for updates, which I believe might be every hour, every 60 minutes, I'm not sure. But they'll check for updates. And when there's an update, so after you approve the updates, the client downloads them, installs them actually, and then stages the reboot. And then here is the time. So you can say every day at 3 a.m. That just means if there's any pending staged updates on this client at 3 a.m., go ahead and reboot. So even though you might think, well, I don't want this to reboot every day, it's not going to reboot every day, only if there's patches that you've approved or you've set for auto approval. So we're just going to click OK on that, and then we're going to go to the other option, which is specify Internet Microsoft Update Service Location. So this basically tells the client, okay, where do I go to find this WSUS server? So I will double check my notes here. So WS19-WSUS-01. And that same server is specified for the first option, and also the Internet Statistics server is just to the clients who use this server to send back their information on how many updates they need, how many updates they're still waiting for, or if anything has failed. So we hit OK on that. So that is all that's required. There's obviously many more options you can specify. So the way this works, the default configuration is that we would be specifying our own computer groups in WSUS, not necessarily tied to AD, but the preferred way is to turn on enable client-side targeting. Now when you click enabled there, when the client detects the WSUS server, it will, kind of like a DNS thing, it will provision itself and put itself in the corresponding WSUS group. So whatever computer groups, whatever security groups you have in AD that computer objects are members of, you just need to make sure that you create those same groups in WSUS and keep that balanced. Because then when a new client comes on and it gets the GPOs from initially joining the domain, it will have the information and know which group to go into. Alright, so we'll close that up, and that setting is now ready. So clients check every 90 minutes, I think give or take 30, an offset of 30, so eventually, and I can show you, let me just go to the DC. So you saw, so Windows Update, if I go to Windows Update settings here, now I can click retry. I'm not sure if this, I'm not going to, okay, so now we know because nothing's been approved or this is up to date, it didn't actually do anything. But now once we go, let me go to another DC in my environment and show you what it looks like once the client has received that GPO. You can see check online for updates for Microsoft Update. And I can go to view policies, And now we can see all these policies set by that GPO are now set here. Schedule, update, install every week. Get updates for the Microsoft products, which I checked. And so then check for updates here will simply hit the WSUS server. That's an error because the server's still synchronizing. But I can always say check online for updates for Microsoft Update. This will bypass the WSUS server and go right to the internet. And the good thing is it's obviously not complete control, but you know, the vast majority of your users aren't going to really know what that even is or what that is available to even use. And this is just doing a cumulative update for .NET. So that is the basics. Let me go back to the WSUS server. And I will again open up the WSUS. I will just show you the interface for the computers. So let's go back to synchronizations, verify that we're still slowly progressing. And yeah, again, this is just a 4-core, 8 gig of RAM box. So like I said, WSUS is kind of in the initial configuration. Give yourself a lot of time to get it going because you know, the initial sync does take a while. So yeah, we're only at 16%. So computers here. This is where you can add a computer group. And we could say you know, initial canary ring. So when you go through and choose which updates to approve, when you select all the updates you want. Let's say it's all the critical updates and all the optional updates that are released on Patch Tuesday. You then choose in that, once you approve them, once you right-click on all of them and click Approve, it'll say, okay, which computer groups do you want to approve for? You can just choose the initial canary ring. Let's say you do it on the evening of Patch Tuesday. Then we can create another group, beta group. So this might be something you do like the following Tuesday evening. So you'll again go back into the WSUS, and I don't have time to go through all the different options for updates, but all the updates appear here, so then you can just select them all and right click and choose Approve, and you can choose the beta group. And then again, this is kind of similar to the stable, say execs. And it looks like I can't use parentheses, so let's do this. Stable executive level. So this would be, you could go through maybe on Patch Tuesday of the following month, choose to install the prior patches that you had already approved for your initial rings, and we're assuming that you've not run into any major issues. And then you can simply select all those updates, right-click Approve, and then choose the stable execs group. Then all the computers in that security group tied to AD will get the updates and install the following morning at 3 a.m. So let's see if this is gonna go to change the status any and say refresh. I don't know if this will show us anything before the initial sync is complete. We can come back to that. Let me just pause here. And of course, right after they pop up. So let's see. These are all the unapproved updates. So this is all that it's downloaded. So obviously it hasn't downloaded everything that it eventually will have. But if we go, and actually I'm going to right click and choose date, release date. And sort by release date. And of course, yeah, we're going back all the way to 2016 because we can. So if we go recently, and okay, so as far as it's gotten is July. Well, let's say it's July. We'll say it's July past Tuesday. So here are the updates. Cumulative update. So this is the standard. This was July's cumulative update for Windows 10, 20H2, x86. So this is how granular you have a control of choosing which updates you want to choose. And it's very tedious. Now it's loading from the database. It's very slow because again it's synchronizing. It's a big the database engine is really taxed right now, so it's kind of difficult to even show, because every time I click on an update, it's loading the information from the database on the criticality, when it was released, does it require a restart. So as you can see, it's not very receptive right now. But that is where you just mass choose a bunch, deselect the ones you don't want. Let's say these are the patches I want to install. Right click Approve, and I say the initial canary ring, and I'm going to say Approve for install and hit OK. and that would then just simply approve those. So the next time any computer device in that ring, in that security group tied to AD, checks for updates, which is done automatically in the background every 90 minutes, 60 minutes, it would download and install and reboot the following morning at 3 a.m. So you, with WSUS, with that WSUS barrier there, you have that ability to completely control which updates get pushed out to machines or pulled from machines and when they reboot. So that's the main advantage. All right, so that's the crux of WSUS. Let me go back to, let's see which box we have here. This is one of the DCs, that's fine. Let me go back to my other client. And I just want to see, because sometimes the group policy takes a while to take effect. Just going to run a quick group policy update / force. And again, this doesn't always, in my experience, even if this would complete successfully, or it might give you an error. But yeah, so computer policy update has completed successfully. So that tells me, assuming my AD replication is working, that it would have gotten the policy for that GPO. But how Microsoft has the GUI of Windows up. Oh, there it is. So it just actually did work. Imagine that. So check for updates will now hit the WSUS server, and again, when it's synchronizing, it's tasked beyond belief, and it'll simply reject client connections, which that was. But again, you can always bypass WSUS, which again users aren't going to need. But it's a good thing to have as an administrator when you're on a machine trying to get up to date. You can just simply click that and get everything that's available from Microsoft for that. So I'm going to end that here with WSUS, and I'm going to pick up with the next stage of Windows Update for Business. And welcome back to the Managing Windows Update session. I am now going to go through a demo of setting up Windows Update for Business in your environment, and we use that using group policy. On my Windows 10 client box, I'm going to open up the Group Policy Management Console. So I've set up 3 GPOs for the 3 different rings that I want to assign in my environment, and I will be able to use group policy and simply filter these to a specific AD security group and add computers into those groups, so that this GPO, of course, will only be affected and will only be enforced on those devices. So 3 different rings kind of go hand in hand with what I talked about on the WSUS session, was setting up how often these machines will get updates, how long to defer quality updates for testing purposes for the higher rings, and which ring potentially in the Windows Insider program these devices can join. So I'm going to right click on the canary. This is the initial, canary in the coal mine. It's going to find out if there's any critical issues with any of these updates that come by, especially feature updates. So we're going to scroll down to Windows Update and Windows Update for Business. So the canary ring, you can go to Manage Preview Builds, say Enabled, and just Enable Preview Builds. This is just to say that for this ring, even though we're going to be setting the options here, the devices can opt into the Windows Insider program. So it's kind of just a nice solid thing to have. If you wanted to stay at a specific feature update like 2004 or 20H1, that is where you would use this setting, which if you want to have a specific GPO for just some mission critical and you literally don't want it to go beyond, say, 2004 or 20H1, you can simply say enabled, and you can type in that specific version which is available on this website. It's the Windows 10 Update History page. And let's see, so select when quality updates are received. So these are the monthly updates that come out. So you can enable this, and as this is the canary ring, you probably wouldn't have to do this. So as far as I'll explain here, we'll just leave this not configured. But here's the main item. Select when preview builds and feature updates are received. So we're going to enable this. So for this, we're going to choose the slow ring, which I believe is the beta channel now in the Windows Insider program. So this is testing like the next feature update to Windows 10, the coming fall release of Windows 11, So that is what will automatically get pushed down to these devices, the canary ring. And if you want, you can, after it's updated, let's say, right now they're pretty much deployed on Thursdays. If you want to deploy it on Monday, just set it to 4, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And Monday, they'll actually get the updates and get pushed out. Alright, so that is how that ring works. And once all those settings are configured, which I should go ahead and do that. Enable, slow. Okay, select when quality updates are received. We're just going to say enable, and it's going to say 0 days, which is fine. And so disable safeguards. So Microsoft puts out compatibility holds, meaning like if there's a specific hardware device on your computers, let's say like a Realtek sound card, and if there's a problem with like the drivers for that Realtek sound card, Microsoft will put a compatibility hold, meaning it'll see that configuration on a device that's not managed by a tool like this, and just stop holding, stop the feature update until there is a resolution to that. What you can do if you want, especially in the canary ring here, is enable this so that even if there is a compatibility hold put out, this will essentially disregard that and process the update anyway. Alright, so let's close that. Let's go back to the release preview. I'll quickly go through the settings on this ring. Windows components, Windows Update for Business. This is the release preview. So we're going to enable this. We're going to go to release preview. So that's the ring we want to get on. So the release preview right now on Windows 10 is testing 21H2. That is probably going to be released October-ish, but don't take my word for it. And we're also going to defer it for 10 days, just to be a little more, waiting for things to possibly cause an issue. So we'll just have a little buffer there. So 10 days after Microsoft releases it, your devices in this ring will get it. Quality updates are received. We're going to set this just to 3, just so it's more stable as these monthly quality updates come out for this release testing phase. We don't disable safeguards. We're simply going to enable the manage preview builds and keep it enabled. And we don't need to set the target version, a specific version. So stable. So here are the devices that you want to have waited for quality updates and feature updates to bake a while, and go through your higher ring levels of testing. So this will be a little more lax, a little more conservative. So select when preview builds are received. So here we're going to simply choose semi-annual channel. So this is literally when let's say 21H1 came out, I think in May of this year. That is right in coinciding with when Microsoft dubs it ready for business. It will then be available. But instead, we're going to defer it for 30 days because we can, or even 45 days. It doesn't matter. It's up to you. But like, let's say this comes out on Patch Tuesday in May, whatever day it was. So this will take it to the end of June. So again, there's been time to bake, and by that time there will have been at least one, if not more, monthly cumulative updates that will help to stabilize that build before it gets out to your stable channel. Let's hit OK there. Quality updates are received. We're also going to be very conservative and set this to 30, which is the max. So when a new stable update, a new monthly quality update comes out, let's say September, which is actually coming out just October by the time this airs. So October Patch Tuesday, when those updates come out, November, approximately November Patch Tuesday, or 30 days from the initial date, is when these computers will get updated. Alright, and again, we'll just go to Manage Preview Builds and enable them just for safekeeping. And we don't have to select a target. So again, what you could do for a, actually I could probably just go through it here. I want to set a new, I want to set a new GPO, Windows Update for Business, Mission Critical. So let's say you have a class of devices that simply need to stay on a certain version. The software vendor or whatever application is installed on these devices needs the device to stay on, say, 20H1. So we'll go to Windows Update for Business. Select when I received, we'll say enable, we're going to say semi-annual channel, and we're going to delay, well, we don't have to delay, this setting will be moot in a moment. So when quality updates are received, we're going to go ahead and max that out to 30. Manage preview builds, we're going to turn this, we're going to disable this so that actually the devices can't get into the Windows Insider program, so they are more stable. And then select the target version. So once these devices hit 20H1, get on 20H1, they will not go beyond that, and that's a hold. So that keeps those obviously mission critically stable. And again, setting these GPO settings, including the, and again, if I go back to, I apologize, if I go back here and go to Windows Update again, not just in Windows Update for Business, but Windows Update, there are of course other settings you can choose here to essentially disable users, not administrative users, from making any changes. So remove access to pause updates, remove access to use all Windows Update features. So I mean that would be probably a pretty decent setting to use. Scan, download, install is simply not available in the GUI, so that's the way you can lock down those mission critical devices. So that is essentially how that works. I'm going to let this one sit, and we'll be right back, and I will cover the Windows Update settings GUI. And welcome back to the final part of my session on managing best practices for managing Windows updates. So I'm just going to spend the last few minutes here that I have to go over the Windows Update settings user interface in Windows. So I'm going to go to my Windows 10 machine, go to Settings, Update and Security, Windows Update. So basically, if you've been following my entire session, you see that I did configure a WSUS server in this AD environment. And this computer is joined to AD, so instead of just check for updates, there's also a check online for updates link. So when you install Windows 10 Home, Windows 10 Pro, and you wouldn't have any other group policy settings affecting Windows Update, you will only see a check for updates button, which will simply go out to the Microsoft Update interface network and download the latest patches that are available. Once you have WSUS and the correct GPO settings in place and deployed down to your clients, they'll see these too. So check for updates will then hit the WSUS server and check for any approved updates that this device is in a group in WSUS for. And then also clicking the check online for updates for Microsoft Update, of course, bypasses WSUS and goes to the internet. So here you can see some of the settings that we've gone through and configured, especially in Windows Update for Business. But pause updates for 7 days. You can also, if you go to Advanced Options, if it says you can manually choose how long to pause updates, but you have 7 days, up to 7 days to choose. Active hours is basically the active time that the user is typically using their computer. And I think by default it's set from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., but you can set that manually, change, and you can also change it via group policy. But you can also turn automatic activity, and it'll simply log when the user is using their device and to adjust appropriately to not install updates during that time. View update history simply lets you choose, look at all the installed patches. There's quality updates, which are the monthly updates each month. There's driver updates, if there are any for your system. Definition updates, of course, it's all the Windows Defender antivirus signature updates. And then other updates will be like the malicious software removal tool, .NET framework updates, things like that. Right, advanced options. So here is where we can see where we've had some massaging by our AD group policy. So you can see some settings are managed by your organization. So if you remember when I checked that box for the, I believe it was WSUS, receive updates for other Microsoft products. I checked that on, so that is on now, and it is forced on essentially. And you see there's even more updates that are now set because of the Windows Update for Business settings I also enabled in this test lab. So the feature update has been deferred. What the actual deferral period is, that just means that these updates here, listed here from group policy, are affecting how Windows Update operates. Downloading updates over metered connection is not used very often, but if you have a pay-based data plan. Restart this device as soon as possible. Most users wouldn't want that on, but that's why it's off by default. But the GUI will be pretty bombarding in terms of causing updates. But this will nicely show you a notification when the PC does require, which means the start button, the power button here will have a little orange light next to it. So that's basically how that works. Let me just pop over quickly and show you the Windows 11 as of the latest beta build available. If I go to Start and go to Settings, go to Windows Update. So as you can see here, the GUI is a little different, obviously, with Windows 11. I think there are some nice updates on the interface. So check for updates again. We'll check the WSUS server for any patches. I haven't approved any Windows updates, Windows 11 updates yet on the WSUS server, so there won't be much here. But again, here's the link that we just saw. Check online. So the same options are available. It's just set up a little differently. Again, receive updates for the Microsoft products is forced on. This isn't available due to the policy we have in place. Optional updates, which might be feature updates, would also be listed here. And again, other delivery optimization settings that you can choose are all available like that. So that is the Windows Update settings GUI. So I want to thank you for joining me on this session. I'll be available during the chat part of this session if you have any questions. But again, you can definitely search the Petri.com website for my content and leave comments if you have any questions. I want to thank you for joining me today. Have a good one.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the final session of Petri's Get IT Endpoint Management one-day virtual conference. Some folks might think of this as, the denouement, the part where we tie up the loose ends of the story. Some people might think of it, after all the great stuff we've seen so far today, might think of it as a touch anticlimactic. I like to think of it as the dessert. Like, we've had the meat of the meal. All the folks before me, Russell and Dean and Rue and all those guys, have really done some amazing stuff. And I'm just going to kind of wrap it up. I'm like the chocolate and the ice cream and the fruit and stuff at the end. But for the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to be talking about two things that are near and dear to my heart: users and PowerShell. But before we go on, who am I? Who is this person talking about users in PowerShell? Well, I'm Todd Clint. Good to meet you if we haven't met already. I am an Office server, Office apps and services MVP. I've been an MVP of various flavors for going on 16 years now. Somehow I feel like the character from Office Space, where I just kind of, Microsoft forgot about me. They just keep renewing me every year. But it's been I get to hang out with folks like this, so it's been great. What have I done? Well, I'm a writer. I've written a bunch of SharePoint books. I speak at conferences and things like that. I podcast, I blog, all of those things. And right now I am a consultant at Praxis Consulting with some friends of mine, Mark Anderson, Julie Turner, those folks. And all of the things that I'm going to talk about in this session with PowerShell and Microsoft 365 and users and all of that are things that I do every day in my work. These are not hypothetical things. These are tasks that I really do with customers, problems I really solve for them. This isn't vaporware or anything like that. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me at todd.clint@praxisconsulting.com, or I'm also out on Twitter. I like to waste my days there, like many of you, and so you can hit me up at Todd Clint, and I also have a blog at toddclint.com. So any of those ways to reach out to me if you want to see some more examples or have questions about any of this, by all means, just reach out. So this is one of the ways that I pad my deck here. I put an agenda slide in, so when I turn it into Russell, it looks like I've done more work than I really have. But this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why you want to use PowerShell, which modules in PowerShell you want to use, what you want to do with them, and then how to handle some of the credential and authentication issues that you might have when using PowerShell with Office 365, because it is different than PowerShell on-prem. So we're going to cover some of that. First, PowerShell, why and what? So as we've seen today, there is a lot of great functionality built into Office 365, and we have seen various ways of managing that, various great web interfaces and things like that. Why would we care about PowerShell? Why would we want to make things more complicated? Well, there are some good UIs, some good user interfaces out there, lots and lots and lots of them. Every product, every corner of Microsoft 365, every corner of Microsoft in general has its own team that knows its product really well and then builds a UI to purpose-built UI to manage that product. For folks like you and I who end up doing this work in the real world, we use a little functionality here and a little functionality there and all over. And the UIs are very different in multiple web pages and multiple logins and things like that. And so with PowerShell, you can write a PowerShell script or a PowerShell function that has all kinds of functionality that touches different products inside of Microsoft 365 in one place, handle all the authentication, so you don't have to deal with all those different UIs and different interfaces and having them change and things like that. So another reason to consider PowerShell is because the cloud is big, really big. And part of the reason for that is because we have taken a new approach to IT and to helping our users and things like that. And part of that means we just create a lot of things in a lot of places. And that means we create a lot of sites in SharePoint, and we upload a lot of documents in Teams, and we have a lot of chats in Teams, and we have calendars in Exchange and all those things. Part of the beauty of the cloud is that we can grow in all these different directions, and it's somebody else's problem to manage the power and the cooling and the storage and all of that. But the more of these things that we do, the tougher it is to create and delete and manage and all of that. And with PowerShell being a scripting platform, it's very easy to loop through all of these different places and handle all of the vast hundreds and hundreds of thousands of objects that we all deal with on a regular basis. And so it makes it easier for that, but it also is good because all of these processes are very complicated. And like I'm going to talk later about a deprovisioning and offboarding process for users. And there are several steps in that, and you don't want to forget any of those. You don't want to give anybody access to something they're not supposed to have. So if you have it in a script form, yes, we've all got runbooks and documentation, and that's great. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you've got a script, it's even tougher for somebody to mess up a long, complicated process that touches hundreds of objects in dozens of places. Having it in a script increases your likelihood of success. The other thing about this is, I don't know about you all, but my mouse and arm, my mouse and finger, they get very tired from all of the clicking that I do during the day, sifting through funny cat memes and things like that. And so we can save some of the trouble of navigating around all these web pages by just typing a script and having it do all that. We can make these long, onerous processes easier to do, and again, it reduces the chances that somebody misses a step. But then it's just a physical thing, just saves all that, the wear and tear on those mouse and appendages. Like I mentioned, we've got these long processes. The longer a process is, the more complicated it is, the greater chance errors are introduced. And so if we script it, we don't have to worry about that. And because these processes are long and complicated, we do need documentation because, whoever's creating this process is likely not going to be there for the rest of their lives. And somebody else is going to come in and refine the process. First person maybe, wins the lottery, moves off to Costa Rica, something like that. And so you want to think about the next person. You want to have some good documentation for them. Nobody does good documentation, except people whose job it is to do documentation. But folks like you and I, we have a task, we have a job, we figure out a way to do it. We get that rush of satisfaction, and then something shiny catches our attention. We dash off and do something else. We're all terrible at documentation. And so one of the things that the script gives you is free documentation. It's right there. You can just look and see what every line is and see what every step is. And you don't have to worry about forgetting a click or any of those kind of things, or forgetting a screenshot if you're documenting that way. The other thing that I do when I write PowerShell scripts is I nearly have one line of comment for every line of PowerShell that runs. And I know some of you that do programming are just wincing at that, but I do that for two reasons. I heard some wisdom a while back that said, write your code as if the next person that will run it is a homicidal maniac who knows where you live. So I try to keep that in mind. The other person that might be running my code next is me. And honestly, I forget some of the things that I do sometimes, or why I did things the way that I do. So I just put lots and lots of comments in, but then, that helps me with the coding process and helps me get the job done, but it's also just documentation. So if you do it in PowerShell, you get that free documentation. And kind of an extension of that, again, thinking about the next person, even though I'm an admin and an admin through and through, I have recently, within the last couple of years, really taken to using GitHub. I create a GitHub repo for almost everything that I do anymore. And it gets me two things. Number one, it makes it really easy for me to share my code with other people. So in a corporate setting, you would want your team to have access to it, so that, again, when you win the lottery and move off to parts unknown, the rest of your team doesn't have to figure out if it was on your hard drive or whatever. It's in GitHub. And again, the other person that it shares it with is me. I've had multiple machines. I got this hard drive right here. This used to be in service, and then it quit being in service. And fortunately, all of the PowerShell that I wrote while I was using that machine, I've synced up to GitHub, and it's all there. So when I hook up my next machine, I just join into that repo and I can get it all again. So that's kind of a weird IT pro thing to talk about, GitHub, but absolutely, if you're writing PowerShell, if you're suffering through this session, you owe it to yourself to do that. And while we're in that uncomfortable, is this really an IT pro or an admin thing? Let's take a minute to talk about VS Code. Now, Visual Studio Code, and I'll call it VS Code because that's less scary, is my IDE of choice with PowerShell. I got a new machine, a new laptop here within the last couple of years. I've got all the list of things that I put on there. VS Code is in the top 7 or 8. It is just the only place that I will do PowerShell anymore. It is just that great of a tool. In the first demo, I'm going to talk about it a little bit and show you how to get your environment set up for PowerShell. But honest to goodness, you shouldn't be just doing things on the command prompt. You shouldn't be using the ISE anymore. We're past those days. Use VS Code. Doesn't make you a developer. You can still respect yourself and sleep at night. And then it also wedges into the GitHub bit, so it's easy to use that way. But really, if you're not already using VS Code, now is the time to do that. I talked about all the different UIs and how every team inside of Microsoft writes their own UI for their own product, and that's an issue. There's also a bit of an issue with that with PowerShell. PowerShell has different modules, different chunks of functionality that you can bolt into your PowerShell host, your PowerShell window. There are many of those as well. The good news is that's a little easier to navigate. And so I've got a list of a few of these on the slide here, MS Online, Azure AD, things like that. We'll talk about those in depth a little later. But the real takeaway from this slide is that URL right there at my blog, toddclint.com/posh, Office 365 modules. And this is a blog post that I've got, and I'll show it in the demo, where I list all of the PowerShell modules that I personally use, again, day to day, all that deal with Office 365. And I've got installs for all of them, and what they're for, and what the current versions are, things like that. And so you can kind of pick and choose. It doesn't hurt anything to have them all installed and loaded into a window. But that's how you're going to get all those. And as I start, as modules come and go, I will keep that blog post updated. For instance, when I first started that blog post, there wasn't a graph module, which is called the Graph SDK. Again, don't let that freak you out, but it is just a PowerShell module. Also, one of the first ones that I ever started using was the MS Online module. That one is deprecated. It's been replaced by Azure AD. It still works, but here recently, in the last couple of months, Microsoft has started deprecating or closing down some of the endpoints that particular module uses. So for instance, if it's not shut off already, pretty soon you're not going to be able to manage licenses with the MS Online module. You're going to have to use the Azure AD module for that. And that will slowly happen. That module hasn't been updated in a couple of years, and they're not gonna update it. So if you're using that one, start transitioning to Azure AD. And then the Azure AD module, I suspect at some point that's gonna probably get replaced by the graph. The graph is the substrate, all of those crazy words that kind of sit underneath. The Intune things that we've been hearing about today, they've got graph endpoints, all of that. So this is an ever-moving landscape, the PowerShell modules that you're going to use. But again, that blog post there will show you the ones that I'm currently using. If you have any questions, you've got my contact information. We can figure out which module is best for what you're trying to do. And there's often, more than one module that will do what you want to do, especially in the context of this session, user management. There's, the Azure AD bit, but there's some of the other modules can include that as well. So now that I've got y'all excited, let's look at what PowerShell looks like when we're using Office 365, Microsoft 365. We'll jump into a demo here, and I'll show you kind of how you can get started with that. Here we are in a Windows 10 desktop, just any, again, machine. This is in the cloud, so it doesn't matter where you connect. It can be, on your desktop, on your tablet, at your kid's soccer game, doesn't matter. You can connect anywhere. I mentioned that I've got this blog post here that has all of the PowerShell modules that I use. So I always, when I'm setting up a new machine, I start here and look at this and get my machine set up correctly. I have pinned PowerShell to my taskbar down here because I'm always going to have it open. For the stuff we're going to be doing, I'm going to install some modules, so I'm going to run this as an administrator and just go ahead and agree to that. One thing I didn't mention in the slides, but something I do every time I open up PowerShell in real life, is I do start transcript. And this keeps a text copy of all of the things that I do in my documents. Now, the reason I do that is because oftentimes when I'm jumping in with PowerShell, I'm trying to figure out how to do something, and then the next day I forget how I've done it. So if I have a transcript, I've got all that. I can go through and see the things that I've done. Also a good CYA thing, if something breaks and you think it was something you did with PowerShell, you can go back and look. My one caveat to this is when you start playing with passwords, make sure that if you type any passwords that you take them out of your transcript. It is just a text document, so you can open up with Notepad afterwards. And all that. So we can see here we've got this get installed module that will give us the modules that we've got in here. So let's just go ahead and copy that out of my blog and paste that in here. And this will give us the module names and the versions. So you can see we've got the Azure AD preview, we've got some SharePoint-y stuff, that's all good. We don't have the MS Online module. So what does that look like? Well, I've got a link here that takes you to whatever the authoritative page is for it, a GitHub, whatever. But right here's the command to install it. So I'm just gonna do that. I'm just gonna install this, paste this in PowerShell, and it will install that module for us. And that will take a minute. And again, I told you can have the Azure AD preview and the MSOL modules installed at the same time, even though they do basically the same things, but they don't clobber on top of each other much. You can see here we get a question about the repository. I've got the code in there that fixes that. Basically just said I'm downloading code from the internet. Is that cool? Are you worried? We're not worried. So let's see if this is available to us now to install. And yep, there it is. And you can see that version number maps over there. So that is kind of how you get them installed. There's also an option for updating them, and I've got a blog post here that talks about it. You can see my Azure AD preview module is running 2.2.51 and it's now at 2.2.119. I'm just horrified at myself, but you can run the update module to get those updated. Again, these are all Office 365, not just user management, so pick and choose the ones you want. You can obviously come back at any time and get one that you want to use. Visual Studio Code, again, that's the interface that I use to do all this stuff. So you can go to code.visualstudio.com and download it. It's a free download. Download it as many times as you want to. And then when you install it, it shows up over here. I always pin that to my start menu because I use it all the time. I even drag it up top and open that thing up. A couple of notes about that. Looks like it's not going to open for me. Let's do it from there. So this is Visual Studio. It's very welcoming. It even says welcome right there. So we can open this up. This does a bunch of very scary developer-y, codey things, but we don't care about any of that. This over here, this extensions, one of the first things I do when I set this up on a new machine is I install the PowerShell extension. That gives me all my fun formatting and all that. You want to get the one from Microsoft, and unless you're really brave, just get the standard one. You can move up to the preview one later. That's where the new functionality comes in. So it's installing. You get that. There's a bunch of other great modules we'll start with this one. You can see they've got an ISE color scheme if you're used to that. I prefer the dark one, and we will not deal with package management now. So I can close that, and then when we start, we do a new file, and I do like a write host. PowerShell is cool, and my typing is terrible. You can see that's not very exciting. It doesn't do anything fun for us. It's because code doesn't know what type of document we have. So down here in the corner, you can see the language is plain text. If we go ahead and add PowerShell, now we get all of this, and we get our color coding. So now if I come down here and I'm like, write output, I can do tab completion, this rocks, and I've got my parameters and all that, so it lets me tab complete all that. So it's a really great environment. You can make it bigger with the control plus and all that to make it all that. The other thing we've got is this terminal window at the bottom. I don't use it much myself. I like the regular PowerShell window, but you can just highlight things and then say run selection. And I don't see, oh, it's under run, not selection. So a run without debugging, you can do that in here, and it just runs your code. So if you want to see what's going on, you can do that. This is good for debugging. You can put breakpoints in. If something's going crazy in your PowerShell, you can go look at the variables and all that. I'm a big fan of this. Now, normally what I do, I don't use this terminal window much because it doesn't have all the coloring stuff and some other things. So I will often just take I will write the PowerShell in here, save it out of here, and then just paste it right into my PowerShell window and run it like that. So I also talked a little bit about the GitHub bit. You kind of want to play with that, and it's something for outside of this, but this integrates completely with GitHub, and you've got your source control here. So you want to make sure you save your PowerShell files a lot, but then if you end up doing the source control, then you want to commit them back in. It's an extra step, but then it's up in the cloud, so if this machine dies or whatever, your PowerShell scripts are saved forever. So enough about this. Let's get back and learn some of the things that we can do with PowerShell. All right, so now we've got PowerShell installed, we've got some modules installed, we've got VS Code set up correctly. Hopefully you've created some GitHub repos. And now let's see what we can do with users and groups and things like that. Again, this is an endpoint management event, but your users are a big part of that. So let's see what we can do. So I mentioned that there are different modules for this. And so the user tasks that you do are somewhat dictated by which module you use. I'm most used to using the MS Online module and then supplanting those scripts and all that with the Azure AD module. The Graph module, the Graph SDK, will do a bunch of this, all of this as well. So there are really no wrong answers. It's really what the most comfortable for you. And then also as you're trying to do things, nobody writes PowerShell from a blank screen for the most part. If you're trying to do, if you're writing PowerShell, it's because you want to do a thing. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go out to Bing and you're going to search for that. And then you're going to find somebody's blog post, and that's kind of where you're going to start. You're going to, customize it to what you're looking for. So which module you use might be dictated by what module the person whose code you're stealing, borrowing, is using. But there's rarely wrong answers. Now, sometimes a module only does specific things. I mentioned earlier that pretty soon the MS Online module is not going to handle licensing anymore, so you'll have to use Azure AD or Graph for that. Now, here are a few on this slide. I've got a few different things that I've used for user management over the years. Creating onboarding, that's a pretty common one. And this is good because everybody's got a complicated onboarding process. So if you can do it in a script, if you can create their accounts, and we had some sessions earlier about hybrid, maybe it creates the account on-prem and then triggers an Azure AD sync to get that user up into Office 365 and then adds them to groups, whatever. If you can put all that in one script, then there's very little chance you're going to mess it up. And you can maybe have parameters for if they're in accounting, make sure certain things happen. They get access to file shares or whatever. But creation is a great process to automate. Setting is another good one. If you've got a process where you want to change policies, password policies, things like that, that's also a good part of endpoint management. So you can do that very easily for all of your users or specific users. Some folks get this, some folks get that. Disabling and deleting. So I'm a big fan of not deleting accounts. The guidance I give folks now for Microsoft 365 is when somebody leaves your company, disable their account, scramble their password, take all their licenses away, and then disable login. Now, if you're doing on-prem sync, then you can maybe put them into an OU or something. But kind of the crux of it is I never delete a user unless I absolutely have to. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And I had the same philosophy on-prem when I did that. The idea being I always want to be able to find that user again and match up their GUID with something. I'm a SharePoint guy, so I want them to show up in the trail, kind of the chain of custody sort of thing. And so I don't delete users if I can get out of it. And so now, I just mentioned like 4 steps on that. Sounds like I'm describing a script. I have, for a couple of companies, created offboarding scripts. So when somebody leaves a company, then we run a script that does all of those things, shuts off the login, whatever. And again, as a SharePoint person, now maybe I go into Azure AD or however, I look for their manager and I send their manager an email that says, I've just confirmed that Al has been disabled, and that way that person knows. Maybe I reassign their OneDrive, maybe I walk through SharePoint and find all of the places where that person was a site owner, and I mean there's just all kinds of great things that you can do for user management when you script this. And again, you can just make your system that much more secure and that much tighter. Another great one is group management is something that you can do. And a lot of, keeping your endpoint secure is making sure that only the right people have access to them. And that's mostly done by groups. That way you don't leave people in places and add people that don't need them done. This is another example of where there are multiple modules to do the same thing. And when we're in Microsoft 365, I assume we're talking about Microsoft 365 groups, O365 groups. And so we can create them and all of that. Now this one, because when you create a Microsoft 365 group, it creates a team and an Exchange mailbox and SharePoint site and maybe a planner plan and all those things. These different commands show up in all different modules. And I was recently working with a coworker and we were talking about writing a script that added a bunch of people into a group and all of that. And she was using the Exchange module to do that because that's what she'd always used and she was most comfortable. I was using the Azure AD one because I was most comfortable doing that. And we were both right. It was just whichever platform, whichever module worked best for us. One of the things that I wanted to mention about that is we have groups now in Microsoft 365 called dynamic groups. And these are groups whose membership is not determined by name. So I'm not saying make sure and add Russell and Dean and everybody to the Petri group. Now instead, I have a dynamic group whose membership is based on an attribute. So I could say add all of the people whose office is equal to Iowa. Add all of the people whose first name is Todd, whatever, and it will dynamically create that group. Now, the great example, the great power of that is as people move around inside your organization, move from department to department, whatever, you don't have to worry about people being left in these groups and having access to things that they were supposed to have access to before, but now don't. And so that was what I was working with my coworker on. Very powerful. If you're going to use those, you do need an Azure Admin Premium P1 license for the admin creating the group, not the members, but the group creation process requires that. And so that's definitely something to look at. Now, another thing that I want to note is that I've used PowerShell for a bunch in group management is with Microsoft 365 groups, there is no nesting. You can't put one inside of the other or put an Azure group inside of an M365 group or any of those pieces. So I've had a couple of customer engagements where they needed to have 2 groups, for whatever reason, one group wouldn't handle it, 2 groups with exactly the same membership. So I wrote a script to do that took all the membership from one group and copied it to another one and did all that. So those are great tasks that PowerShell can really help with. And so enough of the talk, and I enjoy the cute picture of the lemurs here, but let's look at some cute PowerShell instead. Let's jump into some demos. All right, we're back now. When we last were in here, we were playing with Visual Studio. So let's Let's close this out. While we were in the break, I downloaded some more modules, so I want to make sure that they get loaded in here. So let's close this out. Depending on how you write your PowerShell, again, it's all a matter of personal preference. If you want to do it in the host or in the Visual Studio, if you do it in regular PowerShell, I don't do it in an admin one. I only use an admin one if I need to install modules or whatever. But it should be fine either way. One thing to keep in mind is if you're doing it in Visual Studio, you probably don't get the admin stuff the way that you'd like. So we first talked about users. So how can we figure out what to do with users? And I'm actually going to do this in here and make this big for y'all. One of the reasons that I like this is I've got more real estate up and down. And so that's why I prefer that. We'll make it really big for you. Huge, impressive. Okay, so I'm going to do my start transcript because I always do that, just so I can see what I've done. One of the things that we want to do is create users, do whatever. So how do we do that? Well, one of the tools that I use, and again, I've been doing PowerShell every day for like 10 years, is I just do a search for the commands. So I'm going to do get command. I want anything with the word user in it, and I'm going to pipe it through more because I expect there's going to be more than one screen's worth. So this is all the ones that show up on this machine. Now I'm really not necessarily looking for the command yet, but I'm looking for the source, and that's the module. So I've got the Azure AD Preview one, MSOL, SharePoint Online. Okay, so I kind of have a good idea. Now, again, we've got a bunch of these, so it can get a little overwhelming. So what I can do is I can say, only show me the ones from the module Azure AD Preview. Let's get this into a list here that I can take a look at. Oh, get Azure AD user. Oh, set Azure AD user. All right. New Azure AD user. So you'll notice PowerShell kind of has a structure. We've got the verb, get whatever. We've got the prefix. Most modules use that. Most good modules do. So all the commandlets in here start with Azure AD, and then the actual type of object. So Azure AD user. We're doing all by user. So here, user app role assignment. So that's a good way. And if I come up in here and I say I don't want the the Azure AD ones, let's see what MSOL has. So I can do that. Tab complete the module name. So I can see we've got a smaller list, but we've got the same kind of things. Get user, new user, set user license, set user property. Okay, so let's just get a list of my users. So I will use the Azure AD user. Oh, I'm not connected. What do I do? Okay, so this is a good one. So we need to, since these are all in the cloud, we need to connect to them. So let's see what we've got for connect ones. All right, so we've got connect MSOL, connect Azure AD. Well, that looks good. Let's do that. So let's connect Azure AD. Needs to know who I am. Seems a reasonable request. So let's tell it who I am. I am that person. What is my password? Since I can't trust you jokers not to hack into my tenant. That is my person name, and I'm connected. Sweet, so I've got my tenant and all that. Now if I go back up and say, get me my Azure AD users, now I've got them. Now, much like most PowerShell, there's a default set of properties that it shows us. The next thing I always do is get member to see what members those objects have, what properties and methods and all that. So now if I want to come through and get a list of all the cities my users are in, I can do that, even though that wasn't shown in here. Up here I just get their object ID, boring, username, all that. But what if I want their city? Well, that's in here, I can get that. Their country. So then I can do something like get Azure AD user, and then I want to select, I like display name because I'm a people person. And then I want their city and their country, and I'm again pipe that through more. And now I can see where everybody's at. So this is a thing that I've used recently for a customer who has some audience settings in SharePoint Online, and they want to make those audiences based on extension attributes they have on-prem. Those aren't accessible to the user profile service. So I wrote a script that connects with the Azure AD module, pulls down all the users and those extension attributes, packages them up into some JSON, and then ships them up to the user profile service. So that's a good one there. Lots of stuff. So if you want to create a new user, that's one of the examples that I gave. We have new Azure AD user. I always do help, And just to make sure it's the thing that I want, I kind of look at that, okay, but that's really boring. The next thing I always do is up arrow dash examples to see how to do it. These examples aren't great, honestly, but you can kind of see what to do. So I can make a new user, give it a profile, password, all that kind of stuff. So those are now another fun thing. Now that I know that the noun, so I can say get command, and just see what all the things are that I can do with an Azure AD user, because I know that that is so. New, get, remove, set. So set's an interesting one. What does set do? Oh, so now I can do things like set the city, set the sign, all that kind of stuff. So that's one way to go through and edit a user that's already there. So we've got that. So we did that. We talked about groups. So let's see what the commands are for groups. So similar deal, get command that has the word group in it. I know there's going to be a bunch, so do that. All right, so a lot of SharePoint ones, which should have seen that coming. Don't really care about that right now. Azure AD preview, MSOL. All right, good. Let's take a look at those. I like the Azure AD ones. Again, they're the newer ones. So let's do that, and let's copy out of there. Oh, there's a lot of them. But again, new AD group app role assignment. So any of the different things. So kind of the takeaway from this is when you want to do something. So for instance, somebody says, maybe you're a consultant and you always want to set a specific password policy for a customer. And you want to do it in PowerShell because you can click, but PowerShell's cooler. So you're like, how do I do that? Well, good question. So let's do this. Let's do a search for policy. All right. There's a lot of them there, but you can kind of see. But now you can get an idea for the things you can do. Azure AD policy, that's got some potential. So you can do it. Licensing. Let's say somebody says, I need you to assign some licenses to folks. Well, I'm not sure exactly how to do that, or apparently how to spell it. Oh, it doesn't like that. Did I spell it wrong? I did. There we go, spelling it right. So now I can do set MSO. So the idea is whatever you want to do a search for it and kind of hone it down, because everybody's tasks are going to be a little different. But you know what you need to do, so do that. Another one, when I add a custom domain to a tenant, because you always get the on Microsoft, I always do that with PowerShell. And the way I can do the clicking, it's easy enough. But I just wanted to know what that was like in PowerShell, so I just did that. And I got set MSOL domain. And so then I just started poking through that, get MSOL domain, new MSOL domain. That's how I started to do that. So now I've got like 5 lines of PowerShell that add the new thing and confirm it with DNS. So get in there, do the get command, and then look at the modules and see what they have for you. We're coming down to it, folks. The home stretch, we're getting really close. But before I leave, again, this is all about endpoint management and security and all that. I have to talk a little bit about how to handle users and all that inside of PowerShell, because there are some good ways to do it and some terrible ways to do it. When you start writing PowerShell against cloud services, your first step in the whole maturity model, the crawl, walk, run, first thing you do is you just hard code your credentials inside of your PowerShell scripts, because that always works. That's a really bad idea, as you can imagine. I could do a whole session on admin user management, but it kind of boils down to a few things. The Windows credential store built into every Windows box that you have is the way that Windows stores passwords for when you access things outside of that box. So file shares and mailboxes and websites and all of that. That is accessible to you in PowerShell. There's a couple of ways to do it. There's a secret store module that Microsoft has put out. There's a credential manager module that I used before that with a third party. I didn't talk about it much in this session, but I used the Microsoft PNP PowerShell module almost exclusively, and it's got a good module for handling that. However you want to do it, you can get those credentials out of the Windows credential store and then securely, and then use them to connect inside of your script. So for instance, anytime I onboard a new tenant or anything like that, I type the password exactly once. So I add it to my Windows credential store. Again, I use the PNP PowerShell, add PNP stored credential. I use the URL as the name of the credential, the way that it's stored, because the PNP is smart enough to change, to look at that URL when connecting, but you can call it anything. And then I give that username. So I normally I have 2 users for a tenant. I have an admin user and then a user. I paste that in there, type the password once, and then every time I connect with PowerShell, I just pull that out of the stored credential thing. So my scripts, if they run as me, they never need to have any usernames or passwords typed in. So that's kind of the way I've been doing it for years, and I couldn't be happier with that. And again, the PNP PowerShell has some commandlets to handle that, as does Microsoft's secret store thing. The other thing that I want to mention is once you start doing things in the cloud like Azure Functions and all of that, you don't want to be using usernames and passwords. And honestly, if you can get away with that as you're working on-prem on your cloud things, that's good too, because then you don't have to worry about it being tied to a user if you change departments or whatever. So a couple of the things to look at are app registrations and certificate logins. And there's a bunch of information out there about that. I've already ran over time. Russell's going to kill me. But I wanted to kind of put the bug in your ear about that. So an app registration is a way for a script to sign in as an application that you've given permission to, and it can do things. So I talked previously about a script that I used that updated user profile things. I gave it permission to do those things and got in. The other one is certificates. So you can create a certificate and it can log in that way. A bunch of ideas, but don't, I guess the thing is, don't hard code your credentials in. Let's take a look at that in a demo and see what that looks like. All right, we're back for our final demo. So let's talk a little bit about credentials, because again, you're going to get into this, you're going to want to automate these tasks, and you don't want to have your passwords in plain text anywhere. So first, let me show you what we're talking about here. We've got the credential store, Windows Credential Manager, built right into Windows. You can see I've got a bunch of things in here, been going to Facebook and all that. PowerShell can access the Windows credentials and the generic credentials. So I can add a generic credential in here, and then PowerShell can use it, and that works fine. I could do one in here, it'll be great. But I've got another method that I use. We'll leave that open. We've talked about the PNP PowerShell a little bit, and they consume those, but they also create those. So whenever I do one, I just use this commandlet, add PNP stored credentials. You have to give it a name, which is how it shows up in here. Now, one thing I've discovered is that the PowerShell connect for the PNP, if you have one that has the name of the URL you're connecting to, it will just automatically grab it. So I've started just adding them like that. So the example that we used with my previous example was my demo tenant. And so that URL looks like this. We can call it whatever. And then you have to give it a username, and I will give it a username right here. And then because I've got a transcript on, and because you're all watching over my shoulder, I'm not going to give a password. So it's going to ask me to enter the password, and it's going to ask it as a secure string. Okay, so now it's there. So if I go back over here, and I'm not sure if I want to refresh this or not. So now I've got this generic store right here. So now when I want to connect with anything, I can get that. So I can do get PNP stored credential by name. And you can see that it will show me that credential. Okay. Now to use it with something else, I need to specify that we want to get it as a PS credential. So let's do that. And so just to make sure that we've got this, that looks good. Now I'm just going to go up to that same connect command. Actually, I don't know if I might still be connected. So let's make sure we're disconnected. Good. Now let's do connect Azure AD. And for credentials, let's pass that. And now I should always type that extra U before I tab complete. Now I get my users. So the great news is once I've configured this credential on a machine, any script that I run, I can use this kind of thing here, and there's no passwords in plain text anywhere. So now I can maybe, if I have a machine that folks run things on or whatever, I'm making an Azure AD function, whatever, the password never, and this works for all of them. So I can also do connect, well actually let's do it this way so I don't have to retype the whole thing. I could connect MSOL service. same credential. And I never have to type the password. So this is great for automating things. It's great for just saving your fingers. Whenever I connect to a new tenant, I type the password exactly once, and that's when I set this thing up. So the last thing that I mentioned to you is the app registrations. So there's a bunch of ways to do that. If you do a search for it, you'll see a bunch of them. Again, I'm a PNP kind of guy. They have a good commandlet that does this called initialize PNP PowerShell authentication. And it creates an Azure app registration for, and whatever rights you want, and there's some examples in here, but then you can use that to also connect if you have to do things that aren't user-based, so again, environment-based. And the graph understands these. Once you create this app registration, you can use it with PowerShell, the graph, whatever. You get a token or some passwords and stuff, it's all in here. Check this out. I might have a blog post on this later, but this is another great way. Again, and then you have no passwords in plain text anywhere, and your users are safe. So that's important. Folks, that is a wrap. I've gone over time. Again, Russell's going to kill me. He'll probably never invite me back to another one of these events again. Sorry, Russell. I apologize 1,000 times. Hopefully this has gotten you excited and given you some ideas on things you can automate with your endpoint management, user management, and all that in PowerShell. Again, all my contact information is up here. Todd.clint@praxisconsulting.com, @ToddClint. Do not be shy. I'm a really friendly guy. If you've got questions about things, reach out to me. I love learning new things. And so if you ask me a question that I don't know the answer to, that gives me the opportunity to learn something new. So thanks all the folks at Petri for letting me join this esteemed group of professionals. I look forward to seeing you all again, and I look forward to your PowerShell questions. Thanks. Have a good day.
So that's it for today. I'd really like to give a big shout out to all of today's speakers. So that's Todd, Michael, Rue, Maurice and his wingman Jan, and of course to Dean, who started everything off for us today. Now, don't forget that this stream is going to be available on demand, so if you want to rewatch it or catch bits again, you can find that on YouTube shortly. And if you haven't already done so, make sure that you grab the handouts, which include the slides for each session. So you can find them in the link in the description for this live stream. You can find them on the page for each of the sessions, and you can find them on the landing page for the conference, which you can find at petri.com/conferences. I'd like to give a big shout out, of course, to our sponsors, Devolutions, because without them, we couldn't make any of this happen, and they bring this to you for free. So I hope that you enjoyed today's conference and that you found it useful. If you have any suggestions for future conferences, then I'd definitely like to hear from you. But that's it for today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.